Hey friends, my name is Brian Douglas, and I'm going to talk to you about getting traction with GitHub Actions in Python. So GitHub Actions is a feature that's been available to you in your GitHub repositories for the past couple of years now, since 2018. And it's a combination of a bunch of different things that you probably didn't know were inside of GitHub Actions. But if you haven't used them, GitHub Action is all about workflow automation. Now, a lot of folks focus on continuous integration or running your test, but I'm going to talk about a little bit more. But before I jump into that, I want to talk about primitives at GitHub and how GitHub Actions is a combination of all these different primitives. So one of the primitives being the API. You have the connection directly to the API inside your repository to do some automation in your workflow. Webhooks, authentication, those are other two things that it's combined into GitHub Actions to allow you to sort of optimize or over-index and sort of improve workflow for you, for other people on the team, contributors. And I want to build this with an analogy, which is it's a basketball analogy, so bear with me. But basketball, it's a sport. It's a popular sport, at least in the U.S. It's a global sport as well. And the object of the game is basically get the ball into the opponent's net or the hoop. And with this, there's 5 people on the court on each team, so 5 on 5. And every now and then there could be one person who sort of just takes the ball and becomes like the ball hog, or in the context of developers, like maybe not a hog, but like the cowboy coder who everybody sort of waits around to sort of solve the problems for. Hopefully that's not the teams you're working on. If not, you should definitely look for ways to improve that workflow. And one way you can improve that workflow is identifying places that could be improved. And I bring this up because there's this idea of hooponomics where you apply statistics into the game of basketball. So they basically took every single point on the court and identified where was the highest rated percentage place where you could shoot or attempt a shot and have it go in. And they call this place Area 31. Now, Area 31 is the name because 31% of the shots attempted from this point on the court go in. And this happens to do with like most NBA players are right-handed. Also, depending on the height, it's kind of a difficult shot to defend because you could just throw it over the person's head in a nice perfect arc and it goes in. Don't want to get too much detail about basketball, but the thing is, if you know this is a point on the court that you can over-index or you can automate to your plays or to get players to that point, then you could sort of strategize and say, okay, well, we're going to get this ball passed in. We're going to get it to number 2. And number 2 is going to attempt the shot. Number 3 is going to get the rebound. So, like, that's all stuff you can do in basketball. But in the context of developers, you identify repetitive tasks. You identify places to optimize or automate so that way you don't have to wait for deploys to be deployed before you can have your weekend. You can deploy on Friday with confidence. And I bring that up because there's going to be a couple different use cases and things that I'll share about Actions that hopefully will be outside the realm of maybe what you were thinking with GitHub Actions. Now, when you go into your repository, if you have no GitHub Actions at all, you can click the Action tab. It will present to you with this starter workflows. So these are a bunch of Python starter workflows, and they're available to you to embed directly into your repository. And if you click any of these, you'll get a file like this, which is a YAML file. And this is a basic Python CI file, which gives you the ability to run linting and test inside your Python project. So you can also run a matrix of different versions of Python too, which is like shout out 3.9. Like, where did that come from? I haven't actually used Python regularly since last summer on a project. But what I'm getting at is that I'm super honored to be here. And I want to mention this because this is an opportunity for you to all strategize on your team in the project to be able to say, okay, well, the CI is now set, whether you're using GitHub Actions or if you're using some other CI tool. Like, those are solved problems. Like, this definitely embed that into your project. And then that way everybody's better because of that. But the thing I want to bring up is like, what's more than just CI? And the thing that I always do whenever I deploy something to production is I don't really care about performance, which is an unfortunate thing. But like, I do a lot of web apps, a lot of web development using front-end tooling. And there's this tool called Lighthouse, which is built by the Chrome team. And it identifies opportunities for improvement for performance or accessibility. And by having this tool, it actually gives me ideas of like where I can improve or where I can sort of focus on next time I ship a feature for my website or my blog. And the thing I don't do is I don't ever run this or ever think to run this unless someone has a problem with the site. What I love about this is that this actually runs every time I open up a pull request. So with GitHub webhooks, based on pull request, those are embedded into GitHub Actions. So I can say every time a pull request is open, run the Lighthouse action, give me a score. And I'll show you more details about it in a sec. But I bring that up because these are all opportunities for collaboration at scale. You can scale your team. Perhaps you're a small project that only has a couple contributors, or maybe you're the only contributor. If you can scale the team or scale these interactions to the point where anybody can contribute, it doesn't have to be doesn't have to have the knowledge base of all of Docker or all of whatever tools you're using. Just automate those things. Then anybody can approach the project with these. And I like this because, I'll introduce myself. I'm Brian Douglas. I joke that I'm a Beyonce advocate, mainly because I love bringing more people to the fold. I love that Beyonce has been a mentor to Chloe and Halle, who are now superstars, and one of them is going to be starring in The Little Mermaid. I forget which one's which. But what I'm getting at is, like, there's always opportunity to bring more people up, bring more people into the fold. And I'm a big fan of Beyonce. I don't think I need to apologize for that. But I love building small projects, one being the Baybot. Now, this is a project I built that's a simplistic JavaScript and HTML project that simply just interacts with Twitch chat. And I built this because I wanted to build a simple project on GitHub Pages that I can approach. Speaking of simple projects, I built another project leveraging just YAML files and also some quick scripts to build the top 8 page from MySpace, but on my GitHub profile. And I did that powered by a GitHub action using things like the setup Python. It gives you an environment to write Python scripts and have those run every time you open a pull request, every time you open an issue. In my case, every time someone opens an issue, they get an issue template that allows them to add themselves to my top 8. The other thing I like to focus on is, like, how do I improve the experience for issue management? Now, every year this thing happens called Hacktoberfest. I get a lot of contributions for Hacktoberfest, and I enjoy it because I'm a small project maintainer, and it's a way for me to sort of bring more people in the fold. So in anticipation of this, I built this action called Take Action, which allows anybody in the repository to assign themselves an issue. And I do this intentionally because a lot of the conversations I have back and forth with Hacktoberfest contributors is like, is this available? Can I work on this? And in my contributing.md, I say, if it's unassigned, you can work on it. Just assign yourself and let me know if you have any questions. And I sort of try to over-index and optimize that. I'm going to get contributors during October, so I might as well make it easy for them to sort of read the guide, assign themselves an issue, work on the project, find documentation on how to contribute, and then we can sort of move on and we can continue to progress with hopefully them sticking around as being regular contributors. And this is the actual action that I've written. It's written in Bash. It's using, some pretty generic Bash stuff and also providing the action environment. The runner provides me GitHub tokens as well as event paths, and it's all stuff I have access to be able to assign someone to issue. Now, the one thing I want to point out is that I didn't think of this action. This action came from a conversation I had with the Pandas project, and they wrote this first. They wrote it a little different than I did because they are better developers than I am, but I was able to take their context and what they wrote and apply it to my project just by simply copying and pasting. Who would have thought? But what I'm getting at is that all these GitHub actions, they're all open source. They're available for you to read. You can check out my project's actions. I could check out your project's actions, and we could all learn and grow better. Like the term is like the rising tide is raising all boats. So I don't have to like beg you for your proprietary CI tool or automation tool to check to see how you sort of fix things. It's all embedded inside your GitHub repository. Speaking of which, one thing I love doing since I got a lot more contributions in October, is using this action called a release drafter. And it basically does that. It drafts up your release based on whatever gets merged to the default main branch. And you can see here, Dependabot had a field day a couple months ago in my project, but I'm able to organize that and we can showcase to see, okay, well, we bumped this version of that and that version of that. And then we have a couple fixes that I'm able to sort of orchestrate or label into a different section. And this is all in the power of Release Drafter. So again, open source, you can check it out. It's a free project, it's open sourced. And I love that I'm able to sort of have a solved problem with not even knowing that releases was something I wasn't even building was a problem. I mentioned briefly Jake Jarvis's Lighthouse action. This action I love. It's open sourced. but it also, inside your action logs, provides you your Lighthouse score. So here I can see every time a PR is opened, there's a Lighthouse score. So if I want to go back to all the PRs that were merged, the last 10 of them, I can go check all the logs and see which one has a PR or has a score that went up or down, so we can have context. This is super powerful. You could also create an action to print this as a comment on your PR as well if you don't want to dig in the logs, or you can upload an artifact, a downloadable file, to be able to check that out as well. I can't go through all the tips, but I do have a YouTube account, youtube.com/Bduggy. I have a tips and trick playlist. Check it out. If you're interested, I made MySpace in 2020, which is what I mentioned up front. I really hope that you enjoy GitHub Actions. Hopefully this sort of got the wheels turning. And these are my social handles. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
So I'm Cheuk, and if you are a maintainer or if you love to have your own library, Python libraries on PyPI, feel free to contact me. These are my contact details right now showing on the screen. I'm a very friendly person. Feel free to contact me. I'm Cheuk, and what do I do? Who am I? I am actually, I would say that I'm a Pythonister, and I love open source project. I have been involved in quite a few projects in the past few years. One of them is TerminusDB, which is an open source graph database. I'm working with the team right now full time, which I feel very blessed. Also, I love organizing events. I just get more and more engaged in organizing community events, especially community conferences like EuroPython, PyData Global. I also organize Pyjamas, which is an online conference. Also, one thing I love is sprints. So I'll be organizing a few mentored sprints, which we encourage new contributions to open source libraries. New contributors will get basically help from the maintainers of the library or people with more experience, so they would feel more comfortable making their first pull request. Also, I love streaming. I love talking, as you can see. So if you like seeing me live doing stuff with Python, feel free to follow me on Twitch. So today, the story is basically about my story that I'm maintaining the Python client of TerminusDB. I'm very proud of doing it, and there are moments that I made mistakes, including the story that I'm going to tell you today. So please enjoy. So being a maintainer, of course, is very exciting things. You gotta organize the issues because people can open issues on your project. Some of them may be something that is, for example, bug report or feature request, then you have to triage and assign it to the right person in the team. Lots of the open source project is not a one-man band, because then you will have people that you may assign the issues to, that they would have a look or they would be working on it. Also, some of the issues may be a question, so you have to basically answer it. So that's some of the very heavy lifting job right there. Code review, if you are very lucky to have contributors, then they send pull requests, you have to review it. Sometimes it takes some back and forth, so also some work was put into it as well. Leading sprints, like I said, I love sprints. I love bringing new people on board. There's nothing more happy than seeing new contributors to be contributing to the code. So it's something fun to do, especially now when we have, safely, being indoor and at home, we could do something fun with open source project. And releasing, of course, all this hard work need to be put into a product that different people release it in a different platform, different way, but because I'm maintaining a Python library, the way to go is to upload it on PyPI, which is the Python index library. I'm sure that everybody knows. And it's some fun stuff going on there, especially when things went wrong. So usually, so there's a lot of ways to release libraries on PyPI. You could, of course, build a wheel with setup tools, or now you can use different things like poetry and other stuff as well. But what we normally do, I think a lot of projects do the same, is to have a continuous integration process to deploy it. So you can set up a new environment with different setup, for example, different versions of Python, and run all the tests, and then deploy it. So what we do is that we used to use Traverse, and now we use GitHub Action because our code base is hosted on GitHub. So GitHub Action is a very popular tool nowadays. That what happened is that you will spin up some new images with GitHub Action with different environment setup, and with talks I can have new environment that you can easily install dependencies and you can run everything there. So, which is great. And of course, run the tests. So you can actually, it allows you to run tests on different versions of Python. You can choose, what we do is like we run from Python 3.6 to 3.9. I think 3.10 is coming soon as well. And also generate the docs, because a lot of times when you make changes, you have to also update your documentation just to make sure that, everything is stay updated. So people know what's have been changed, and then they will be, documentation need to match with the product, right? So yeah, that's why it's good to integrate that in the the CI process. Then you release it on PyPI. So it's just you just need a token, and then you just put it as a secret on GitHub Action, and then you can release it on PyPI. So it sounds straightforward, but it's not, because there are so many dependencies along the way. Talks, obviously, is one of them. There's also other tools like virtual env that that you use to generate a new virtual environment. There are other test suite, PyTest, we're using PyTest, so that's another dependencies. Of course, the project itself got its own dependencies, so there's a lot of dependencies that got involved. And that's how it become more complicated, because, there are a lot of, things that could go wrong if, the version doesn't match, or in my case, if the dependencies is broken. So the first story is I would describe it as very tasty. Why? Because this is the error that I got. So what happened is that I was doing a release on Friday with my colleague, and then we're just like, okay, everything is good, we are ready. All the tests passed, and then we just push it, right? With the tag, of course, with the new version number, and tag it and push it. And then, the test was passing. Not too long ago, and maybe less than an hour ago, to be honest. And then, it just got broken suddenly. We haven't changed anything that would possibly causing the test to fail or anything. So we just look at the log of Traverse, and then we see this error. What is a pastron activator? What's going on here? Pastron? Like, seriously, this sounds so tasty. It just reminds me of pastry and croissant. I love croissant. So I was like, what's going on? Is it a joke? Is it like someone hacked the library? Because we know that it's from virtual env, right? Because it's like virtualenv.activation.python. So it's from virtual env. So it's like, it's obviously a spelling mistake, but it's so funny that, we just think it's a joke. So do a quick search online, and easily we found the issue that someone already encountered this earlier than us, maybe just a few minutes earlier than us, open a new issue. So we basically go to look at it on GitHub, and everybody was freaking out. We are not the only one that encountered this, because virtual env is so popular. Everybody was like that was running the test at the time that actually has dependencies with virtual env got this error, and everybody freaked out. It's like, what's going on? Why my pipeline is broken? And people there is like, okay, chill, you just roll back, it's fine, it's just the new release got a typo in it. And the maintainer was there as well. It's like, oh, sorry, Friday, not a good day to release. Well, obviously, and there's a typo, we are releasing a patch right away, just hang on for a few minutes. It's like, yeah, okay. So yeah, it's funny. I just find it funny. I don't think it's something that's horrible. And people make mistake. It could be an autocomplete or something, that why this typo is introduced, but it's just funny. And yeah, and like, well, of course, if you're a maintainer, you need to be more careful about what you're releasing. But well, people do make mistakes, right? It's like we can be very, very careful, but people still make mistakes. And in this case, it's a very easy fix. It's fine. It's just caused a little bit of panic attack for everybody. But everything is fine. Everything is fine. It's just so funny that pastron. Like, come on, really? Now I want a croissant. So that's Friday. Well, everything went wrong on a Friday. So this is the first time I encountered something so funny, and of course I remember it, and I always want to tell people about it. The second story, similar thing, not so funny. Why? Because you see that basically I become Sherlock Holmes. Like, it's so difficult to pinpoint what's going on, because this is the error that I get. So this error, if you put it on a search engine like Google, that you'll find a lot of people mention it, is a very common error that you will get. Why? Because this is caused by a version difference between two versions of Python. So for Python 3.7 and before, and for Python 3.8 and after, where this module sits got changed. Well, I think that maybe the core developers thinks that it's make more sense to be sitting under import lib, for metadata to sit under import lib. I forgot which is it, like the before or after version of it, but it's just that the metadata position got changed or something like that. So you have to import it differently. So a lot of, when this change first introduced, a lot of maintainers, of course, oversee this change, and then error, and then you have to include some checks to deal with it. It's a common mistake. It's not that difficult to fix, but it's just a very common mistake. So when I search for what library is causing it, well, I hope it's not virtual env again, but like which one of my dependencies introduced this thing, right? Is a bit difficult. Well, you can look it from a traceback, but I think, I thought it's going to be like as easy as last time. So I wasn't paying attention to the traceback and stuff. I was like, so which of my dependencies is causing this? And it's probably just very easily solved by checking all the release stage, because it was fine a few hours ago. So it may be like something that just got released, right? So yep, I become Sherlock Holmes and just like, okay, I gotta take this case on, and I gotta investigate it. So I check the release date, I check everything, and I thought it's Tux. I genuinely thought it's Tux, because it's the one of my dependencies that got released most recently, right? So it must be it. And I go to Talks, I open an issue, but someone points me out that no, actually it's pip_tool that causing it. And then I was like, well, I don't have pip_tool on my dependency list. What's happening? So eventually, after, I have investigated this for my whole afternoon, again, Friday, my whole afternoon on Friday, that what happened is that in my Talks environment, I have pip_tools as a dependency. That's why the traceback kind of also mentioned Talks, but that's why I thought it's Talks, but actually it's pip_tools. And I went there, the maintainer said that they actually noticed the problem, they are releasing the patch, but because GitHub Action was down for a few hours, again, don't do it on Friday, because nobody assumed that you work on Friday afternoon. so GitHub Action basically was down for a few hours, so their patch is not releasing. I can't release it anyway, so I just wait there for a while, and then after GitHub Action is back on action, then everything's fine. pip_tool's got a new patch, and I got to release my own library. So I guess it's a happy ending for everybody, which is great. And I just found it's a very funny story to tell. It's a small story, but I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Let's get millennial. Hello everyone, I'm Juanita, and today I wanted to share with you some of the lessons that I learned when working on documentation for Spyder IDE. So first, I wanted to talk a little bit about who I am. I am a mathematician, so this means that I have little background in software since my background is actually in pure mathematics. I have been working on Spyder for over 2 years. So for those of you who are not familiar with it, Spyder is an integrated development environment for Python. It is open source, and I have also been working on documentation for over 1.5 years. My team also calls me the community manager, which means that I do things that are not only code related, but also surveys and videos and social media content and other community work. And the last thing that I wanted to share with you today is that I am a tutor, and I worked as a kids tutor for a long time. And this is a really important part of my background since it has shaped the way that I do things today, and it has definitely impacted on the lessons that I learned. Okay, story time. So I wanted to start this talk with a story. So Carlos Cordova, our lead maintainer for Spyder, came to me one day and he told me, we have a problem. There are many users that are breaking their environments because they're mixing their packages from pip, conda, and condaforge, and they're having trouble to bring them back to work. This is a very common issue. It's really hard to explain all the things they need to do to get their environments back to work. And I have been trying to help them on Git, on the issue tracker, on Stack Overflow, but it's really hard to keep track of all the problems that people are having, and I don't know how to help them. So I said, let's make a video. And this is basically how the Spyder says don't mix pip and conda video that you're seeing on the screen was born. This is the first of the series Spyder says, hence the name of the talk. And this is a really complete explanation of what people should do when they break their environments. It goes through all the steps necessary. And it is a really long video. It lasts like 8 minutes. And this is a reason why I decided to make it fun. So it has a lot of memes, it has screenshots, music, bloopers at the end. And the reason why I did this is because I wanted for people to have some material where they could go to solve these hard issues that they were having, to call their attention, and to basically help them solve this issue in an easier way than like answering them on Git or Stack Overflow. And I guess my message with this story is, usually being a developer makes it hard to put ourselves in the position of users and understand exactly what they need, right? So it is really important to consider the preferences of the target audience in software, which is, I think, necessary to generate the relevant content for users. So in the case of Spyder, nowadays, a lot of users are students or people who get into software very young. And I think new generations are the future maintainers, right? So we need to take their interests into account when writing content for them. Here is where the key concept of my talk comes, and it's empathy. So a couple of months ago, I wrote a blog post, and I hope I can share the link with you, which is writing docs is not just writing docs. So I think the main idea of my blog post is saying that developers and especially maintainers should be concerned not only about writing good code in their projects, but also about creating educational and promotional content for users to be able to get the most out of these projects. But empathy is the main concept in these. So, context. I wanted to tell you my own experience in Spyder. So these lessons that I'm going to talk about are from my own experience, especially in documentation, but I'm quite sure that they are applicable to other educational or promotional content in software. So what have I done? Basically, I did the docs restructuring to make them user-friendly. And the way I did this was, first, I reviewed all the content and improved the language. I added the screenshots and GIFs. And second, I added some tutorial videos in our new YouTube channel for people to learn different things about Spyder. So when doing these two things, I took into account 3 ideas that I will share with you today. So first idea is create different types of content. So why? First, because people learn differently. So there's auditory, visual, there's kinesthetic, and we have to basically generate content that can make people that learned in these different ways learn, right? Second reason is generations change. So nowadays media is very important. Usually people, especially young people, prefer to watch videos rather than reading long PDFs or books. And the third reason why we should create different types of content is because there's different levels of users. There's basic, there's intermediate, there's advanced, and we need to try to provide useful information for all of them. So how did I do this? So in Spyder's documentation, we have currently these paint descriptions, and I added a bunch of GIFs and screenshots for them to have like visual aids and to try to explain easier and in different ways the same reading content that they have there. I also added these videos that I was talking about, and they are divided into like the levels. So there's like this basic level, there's this intermediate level, and in the future I hope to have like an advanced level. And the third thing that I did, which is not directly related to documentation, but it has been important for our community, is live streamings. So live streamings are like boom now, like the new generations love live streamings, and that's why we have like been doing Spydercasts, which is how we call them, in order to share relevant content, related to Spyder. And this sort of allows us to get closer to our users in a way. So create different types of content. Second idea is find the hardest problems. So part of knowing your audience is knowing what they will be looking for. So you want to make sure that you include what people come looking for and find an easy way to solve it, right? So if you find the hardest and most common problems, I think that this is a really good way to like know what people are going to come looking for in whatever content you are developing. In this case, I'm talking about documentation particularly, but I'm sure it applies. So one example of these is our frequently asked questions section that I created on our documentation. So what I did was collecting most of the issues, the most common issues of our issue tracker, Stack Overflow, and Gitter, and I tried to put them all in one place with summarized answers. So as you can see, I also split them by topics, and this is a really easy way to have a solution for a particular question that a user has. And the most relevant thing about these is that they're based on real problems. I took the most common things that people were asking for, and I basically summarized them in order for people to find them easier. And a second example of these is our troubleshooting guide. So this has like the most common steps that we can think of for solving bugs when working in Spyder. So find the hardest problems and try to find an easy way to solve them. Make the content enjoyable. So I think this is the hardest one. So when dealing with hard problems, content tends to be long and complicated, and this usually causes people to get bored or distracted and you lose their attention. So I think a good strategy for people to get the complete information is to make the content not only useful but fun. So it is not always easy to do this, especially when creating content for software, but I think the Peep Conda video is a very good example of doing this. So it's basically solving a hard problem in a relatively long video, but making it fun in order to call a user's attention and make them watch it complete so they can actually solve the issue that they are having. Even with written content, which is actually harder to make fun, it is possible, I think. So one thing that I did, for example, was writing the troubleshooting guide as a medical guide. So it is a really, really long manual, but it's split it into sections that have a fun name, basically. So it is easier to follow and a little bit less boring to read, I would say. So make content more enjoyable. I have here the screenshots of the bloopers of some of the videos that I have posted, and I think this is a way to call people's attention and basically give them some content that they are going to enjoy, and it's also useful, right? So this is the end of what I wanted to share with you. I think these 3 ideas have made me write docs in a better way, and the reason that I have done this is basically to try to find what users need and what users are looking for right now. So my main purpose of today was to highlight the importance of considering the preferences, the behaviors, and the interests of the target audience when designing content for software, and how I have been trying to achieve it while writing docs on Spyder. So let's get millennial. Thanks, and I hope these ideas are useful for your projects.
Hi everyone. It's great to be speaking at the PyCon US Maintainer Summit. My name is Catherine Michael. My talk is called Bringing Pinax Back to Life. A little bit about me. I'm a consultant to the Wharton School. I work on a game simulation framework project called Simple. I'm a Pinax maintainer and web developer and a DEFNA board member. My talk is about Pinax. Pinax is an open source library of reusable Django starter projects, apps, and themes for building websites. When developers began building Pinax in 2007, they had fun adding to it, but eventually Pinax had grown to be around 80 projects and apps. There was not a strategy in place to make Pinax as easy as possible to maintain, so the maintainers began to suffer burnout. I was hired to work on Pinax in the fall of 2017. In my talk, I'll outline the critical problems I discovered and the solutions I've implemented to make Pinax healthier and easier to maintain. To better understand this story, we need to go back in time to 2008. Some Django enthusiasts had formed a group called the Hot Club of France, named after Django Reinhardt's band. They had found themselves reusing some of the same code patterns while building websites with Django. At the first ever DjangoCon US, James Tauber, one of the original Pinax authors, gave a talk about this new community called Pinax. James talked about his own site, Quisition. Even though it was a flashcard site, much of its functionality had nothing to do with flashcards. The Hot Club of France members had begun to abstract these patterns into reusable starter projects, apps, and themes. As web technologists, they wanted to create a reusable Django library that would make choices and compromises. This would enable them as website creators to focus on the features at the top of the stack. Then in this way, they could go from website idea to realization more quickly. Let's fast forward to 2017. It had been around 10 years since the Pinax idea had been born, and I was hired to work on Pinax. So what was the state of Pinax by now? It's quite common from the very beginning until now for people to discover Pinax and say that it's everything they've ever dreamed of. For example, on this slide is one of the very early tweets about Pinax. Someone says, Pinax is every idea I've ever had. By 2017, Pinax had grown to be a large group of professional quality, interdependent Django projects and apps. This included starter projects with Pinax apps pre-installed and a command line interface to install them. It also includes sophisticated testing packaging and continuous integration configurations. The Pinax GitHub organization alone now has around 80 repos in it. this slide includes many of the more popular ones. In addition to the GitHub organization, Pinax now has a global doc site and a Pinax Slack channel for community and support. And there are also app-specific docs and individual repos. But without a strategy in place to make Pinax as easy as possible to maintain, the maintainers had begun to suffer burnout. And by now, many of the original authors had moved on. So sustainability was lacking. The goal of my work in general has been to make things simpler and self-service. As a result, newcomers, contributors, and maintainers could help themselves, and ideally, therefore, create a culture that could sustain itself. The first problem I came upon was tribal knowledge, and the solution was to document the tribal knowledge. The Pinax authors knew how to do things quickly, but the knowledge remained in their heads. And so the barrier of entry knowledge-wise was fairly high, but the docs were sparse and not beginner-friendly. GitHub did an open source survey in 2017, and they found that documentation is highly valued, often overlooked, and a means for establishing inclusive and accessible communities. For a while, I spent my time figuring out how things were done. I started by creating a release plan that explained the Pinax way of doing things, then moved on to creating a global community health file repo filled with default files, including a code of conduct, a community plan, contributing and support information, information for maintainers, and issue and PR templates. The next problem was that the existing docs were difficult to find, duplicated, and inconsistent. And the solution was to create one source of documentation that would be easy to find and use. There were bits of documentation here and there, some forgotten and some private. Pinax has a wiki, so I organized the historical docs, links, and new release plans in the wiki, and added a blurb to the top of the repo readmes to make all of the docs more discoverable, including global docs, app-specific docs, tagged and published releases, support and contributing information, and release docs. The next problem was a variation in configurations, and the solution was to choose one configuration approach and implement it across projects. A number of people had created and worked on different Pinax projects at different times, and because of this, there was a lot of variation in terms of how things had been done. And I can tell you from personal experience as a newcomer that can make it harder to understand the code. So after some research, I chose one configuration approach and implemented it across repos and detailed this in the release plan. The next problem was a lack of engagement with individuals, and the solution was to reduce the backlog of issues and PRs and catch up with engagement. Between releases, over 160 issues were closed, 100 PRs merged, 30 PRs closed, and countless questions answered in issues in Slack. I began by resolving the lowest hanging fruit issues and PRs knowledge-wise and working my way up. And the idea was to reduce the number until the new and existing issues and PRs would be more manageable. The next problem was a lack of engagement with the community, and the solution was to write more blog posts about plans in progress and publicize them well. I started writing blog posts and tweeting about them, and the post might be about Pinax or some other Django-related activity, and I would mention Pinax. And people began to be interested in Pinax, telling me that they had heard about it through my writing. And I realized that it could have a huge benefit to stop and take time to write about the accomplishments and progress of a project and share it. Even if a handful or one person becomes interested and contributes, it can have a huge impact. The last problem was that tasks were being done manually, and the solution was to automate the tasks to lower the risk of burnout. So how's it going? In July of 2020, I oversaw the completion of an important Pinax release. Around 28 apps were included, and we notably dropped support for Python 2.7. It was a huge milestone for me personally and professionally because I was able to oversee the entire end-to-end process. But Pinax is a work in progress and there's still room for improvement. We don't have a sense of community that we could have at the moment, but I'm happy to say that we're moving forward with a 21.05 release to update the Python Django test matrix and implement some of the automation that we didn't get to with the last release, such as running talks from GitHub Actions and implementing auto-publish to PyPI upon tagging. And the global documentation needs to be improved. So the biggest lesson I've learned in all of this that I want to impart to you is that the last release succeeded because of my communication and teaching skills, which I sort of learned by accident. When my blog post attracted contributors, I received some help that enabled the release to be completed. It wouldn't have been done without the help of the contributors who came along. The release documentation I had written enabled people to contribute on their own with minimal help from me. So if you want more ideas about ways to make maintaining an open source project easier, I've included a slide with additional ideas in my slide deck. And I just want to say that even though Pinax has been fun and frustrating, I'm personally grateful to have had the experience of working on it because I've learned a lot. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me. Thank you.
Hi, my name is May. I'm the co-founder of Virtual Peer, a group coaching service. I'm also a certified executive coach, and I have extensive experience in organizational design, development, and leading transformational change. While I'm not a fellow maintainer, I am someone who has experienced burnout in a previous life as an educator, and I came close to it again when I was a community builder. The first time I experienced burnout, I found myself taking some much needed time out, and during this time, I studied the causes and symptoms of burnout as part of my master's thesis, and I called this disillusionment at work. Now, as an executive coach, I've coached many people who find passion and purpose through their work. People like you who experience challenges with personal productivity and performance as they strive to achieve a balance between who they are and what they do. I hope this presentation sheds some new light on the topic of burnout, and if it resonates, that it helps you to better understand why it happens and seek out the support you need to start thriving again. Burnout, as defined by the World Health Organization, is a syndrome conceptualized as resulting from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. The key word here is chronic. This is when workplace stress is persistent and seriously impairs your functioning. It's characterized by 3 dimensions: feelings of energy depletion or exhaustion, increased mental distance from one's job or feelings of negativity or cynicism related to one's job, and reduced professional efficacy. As you're listening to this, you may recognize in yourself some of these symptoms. Much of the literature on burnout focuses on being able to recognize and manage its symptoms, and many of its causes are attributed to environmental factors. Environmental causes of burnout include the following: feeling like you have little or no control over your work, a lack of recognition or reward for good work, unclear or overly demanding job expectations, working in a chaotic or high-pressure environment, working too much, taking on too many responsibilities without enough help from others, running to keep up, lack of close, supportive relationships, and what probably is one of the most important ones, conflicting priorities. These situations create a lot of stress, and common sense begs the question, why continue to work under these conditions? Research shows that there are occupations in the public social services arena, like education, healthcare, social and community work, that carry more risk of burnout. The work you do as a maintainer and a volunteer for the open source community fits into this category too. Much of the work in these areas are considered vocational, a calling, if you will, requiring great dedication. If you view what you do as a calling, it's important then to be aware of two other factors that can contribute to burnout. These are emotion and identity. So what do I mean by emotion? It's the strong, visceral connection that drives our engagement and keeps it high. You might think of it as passion or the fire in your belly. It's our why and reason for being. This quote is by Steve Marquez, is taken from Nadia Iqbal's paper, Roads and Bridges. In it, she talks about how there is a common misconception that the labor for open source projects is well funded. In reality, it is largely created and maintained by volunteers, people like you, who do it to build their reputation, out of a sense of pride, or simply as a labor of love because it's something they believe in. Therein lies the problem. This labor of love is deeply personal. You might start a project because you see a problem that needs to be fixed, or believe your solution will make the world a better place. Ultimately, it's because you care. And because you care, you give a lot of your own time, emotion, and energy to the project, to the point where it soon becomes an extension of yourself. However, identifying too closely can create problems once the project is released into the public realm. That thing that started out as a very personal, it's no longer yours to own. Much like a parent watching their teenager leaving home, you lose the right to control what happens. Yet you still feel very much connected and accountable for ensuring a successful outcome. In addition to these workplace stresses, there is chronic emotional stress. This is a felt experience, and so there are some emotional cues to pay attention to. These next two slides outline the 6 stages of burnout. This is where you need to pay attention to how you're feeling. Stage 1. So your project is live and in the public realm. You start out as enthusiastic, feel recognized by your peers, and if your project is really popular, your personal brand skyrockets. Users start highlighting bugs, suggesting features. They're very, very excited. This is fine at first, and you want to accommodate all the requests as they come through. But over time, user demands start to accumulate. More bugs, more feature requests, to the point where it begins to feel overwhelming, and you are feeling anxious because the work is getting away from you. Frustration starts to set in as you work harder and faster. But as user demands increase, you can't keep up because you have little or no support. You become mentally, physically, and emotionally exhausted, feeling irritable and constantly on edge, maybe always on the verge of tearing up. This is sustained for a long period of time, until you start to get angry. You feel like throwing in the towel and walking away from it all, but you don't. Out of guilt and obligation to your users, you keep going. Over time, the anger dies down and you resign yourself to the situation. But in doing so, you start to not care so much and disconnect from the work you're doing. That fire in the belly, it's no longer there. This last stage of burnout is when you start to feel apathy, a total lack of interest in your project. You stop caring at all and feel completely alienated. When you're at stages 4 to 6, you start to get into very dangerous territory. This is why. When we're burned out, we get less done and make more mistakes. More and more people depend on the work you do, so there must be some way to keep the fire burning and the project alive. But what do you do? When it comes to mitigating the risk of experiencing burnout, here are some things you can do in relation to self-care. As a cornerstone of our identity, work is the means through which we express ourselves, but don't let it be the only one. Try and cultivate other interests that energize and fulfill you. Build in regular relaxation time for exercise, friends, family, and nature. Practice mindfulness. This has been proven to promote a positive mindset and significantly reduce anxiety and stress. For some people, having some firm boundaries in place helps to reduce the overwhelm and creates a professional and emotional distance, while still allowing you to keep your obligations to work going. For example, delineate your time between work and home life. Have a different physical space for where you work, like an office or a co-working space. Limit scope creep. Build your own product roadmap with clear deliverables and timelines. Publicize it and keep to it. Adopt an upvoting system on proposed features to help with prioritization. Turn off notifications and set aside fixed times to check in and comment on feedback. Ask for help. Accept help. Learn to let go and delegate. You can do this by identifying specific pieces from your work stack that other people can take forward and own. And above all, try not to let your work be everything to you. It's clear more needs to be done. Dealing with burnout is not something to be ashamed of. It's not a sign of weakness, but rather of a system that is broken. To have a thriving, sustainable, and healthy community requires these challenges to be addressed head-on at a systemic level. Number 1 on that list should be finding ways to promote psychological safety and making it easier for you to ask and receive help with your projects. Ways you and the wider community can do this are by creating a support channel or online peer support groups, building in opportunities to mentor and be mentored, to have community moderators be more demanding of its user base, ensuring quality of feedback is kept constructive and removing toxic members. This next suggestion merits broader discussion, and it's been touched on before by other speakers. But I would also consider monetizing those projects that are in high demand and under-resourced. Some of these may be done already. You may also have some other ideas. The important thing here is to keep the dialogue open at a community-wide level. As creators, we make time to build something that often emerges from an area of interest or passion, and we do this willingly. In the early days, we invest time and energy for our own personal satisfaction and fulfillment. Our passion projects become emotionally charged because it is an expression of who we are, what we value, and what we believe in. This presentation has attempted to provide an overview of what can happen when what we create crosses over from being a personal passion to a public good, and the emotional toll that this can have on our well-being. When the effort to manage expectations becomes overwhelming, it triggers emotions that can lead to chronic emotional stress and burnout. We've covered signs and symptoms to be aware of and the self-care and community support needed to mitigate it. What I've presented to you today is my perspective, not a diagnosis. Please seek out support from family, friends, colleagues, and qualified medical help if you're experiencing these symptoms and finding them difficult to cope with. If you have any questions or feedback at all regarding this presentation, feel free to contact me at may@virtualpeer.co. Thank you for listening.
Hi, my name is Melissa. I work at QuantSite, and I am here to talk about NumPy, the project, and explain a bit about an experiment in community building that we have been doing called the Newcomers Hour. For those of you who may not be as familiar with scientific computing, NumPy is the fundamental package for array computing in Python. It provides a multidimensional data structure, the ND array, and fast, efficient operations to manipulate those arrays. As of last month, we counted 69 million downloads. These are monthly downloads on PyPI, and we estimate that we have around 10 to 15 million users worldwide. It has received around $1.5 million in lifetime funding, and at any given time, we count around 10 active maintainers. NumPy is used in a range of different industries and scientific disciplines, including data science, image processing, audio and video processing, gene sequencing, and a lot of other areas. It's used in scientific research, finance, the automotive and aerospace industries, sports, meteorology, healthcare, and space exploration, to name a few. The NumPy team has been growing lately. We have been trying to move away from the core dev terminology in favor of teams. So we have a maintainers team, we have a website and a documentation teams with people working on different aspects of our project. This is meant to highlight the fact that we believe all contributions are important and that code contributions are not more important than documentation, website, or community contributions. We have been holding regular community and docs meetings for a while, and this has helped with the communication of other contributors and potential contributors that want to approach our community. And we are trying to engage more newcomers. And when we say newcomers, we are also making sure that we understand that they are not necessarily beginners. People who approach NumPy for a potential collaboration are usually people who have a lot of experience in other areas. For example, they may be people who are longtime users of NumPy and who know a lot about scientific computing, but they have never contributed to an open source project before. Or they may be domain experts who know a lot about programming, but with other languages instead of Python. This helps understanding their motivations and how to engage with them. So what is there to do in NumPy? It is such a big project and there are so many things to do. You can see a screenshot of the GitHub repo for NumPy, where it says that we have around 2,000 open issues and 242 open pull requests. Some of those are code, including Python or C code, and some of those are documentation, styling, or other kinds of issues that we want to work on. We welcome educational content generation, community contributions, website improvements, and a lot more. So who are our contributors? I'm showing here a picture of a yellow sign that says learning, just do it. And of course, that's not what happens in real life. People who approach us to contribute to NumPy are usually people who have not had a lot of experience contributing to other open source projects, like I mentioned before, but they may have a lot of experience in other stuff. However, this is very hard to grasp just looking at GitHub issues or comments or pull requests. So we needed a way to reach our contributors and understand who they are and what they need to thrive in our projects without using just GitHub or being limited to public forums of communication. I'm bringing here a quote that I like a lot from John O'Bacon in his book People Powered: How Communities Can Supercharge Your Business, Brands, and Teams. The quote says, "Building a great community is fundamentally about creating an ecosystem in which people produce meaningful work, are able to thrive, are motivated to keep growing, and can help sustain the future success of the community. Doing this well is about understanding the drivers and motivations of people and using tech as a means to address and harness those drivers and motivations. Don't let the tech dominate your thinking." I really like this quote because it talks about the human aspects of communities and how we should engage with the newcomers that arrive and want to onboard into our communities. This means that if someone is motivated and reaches your community wanting to contribute, the tech should be secondary. This can be taught. People can learn and they can thrive inside a project even if they don't have the technical knowledge in the beginning. It is up to us to mentor and help them find their way into the project. We chose to supplement the GitHub flow of communication with Slack. So why are we choosing Slack, which is in a way a closed form of communication? Many people are afraid to make mistakes in the open, and this is something that I've been hearing from our contributors directly. They say that it is very intimidating to comment on an issue or create a PR to NumPy because they are afraid they're getting it wrong. Slack is also a great way to figure out mentoring and what people need in order to learn how to behave inside the project. And we can actually match people with the work they want to do. So someone who approaches with a lot of domain knowledge, maybe they want to write educational content or maybe they want to work on the code, but they need to be able to find those places to work, and talking to a maintainer is the best way to do that. Getting people to their own goals within the community is the best way to make them stick around in the project. People stay in your project if they find that what they are doing is enjoyable and they are reaching their own goals inside the project. So we want to help them achieve that. We have created in our Slack a newcomers channel, which is not only a place for people to introduce themselves and say what they want to get from the project, but also to meet other newcomers and people who also want to work on NumPy. So what is the NumPy Newcomers Hour? This is a Zoom call which has a goal of connecting with the community. People can talk to each other without the barriers of Slack or GitHub. They can ask questions in a safe environment where they feel they are heard and they can explain themselves. They can meet other newcomers and bond over their own interests inside the project. And they can ask deeper questions about community, roadmap, the historical development of NumPy, and things that would not fit in a public forum. So what's the impact that this has had in our community? You can see here a screenshot of the newcomers channel that we have on Slack, and we have 45 people at the moment at this channel. This is still early days, and not all of these people are contributing, of course, but the feedback that we've been getting from members of our community has been very encouraging. We have been able to identify some issues in our onboarding processes and figure out mentoring for some of them. And we are facing this as a long-term goal, creating a community where people feel safe and where they can do their best work. So what can we see in our future? I've included a picture of a long road ahead, and I think the idea is to think long-term. First of all, we have to realize that lowering barriers of entry does not mean lowering quality for our projects. People can thrive and they can learn to be their best selves inside our project if only we have the infrastructure to allow them to ask questions and feel safe about it. Mentoring and sponsorship go a long way, and so this is something that we need to find the time and the motivation to do. Cross-project actions can be very helpful. Imagine how we can scale up these kinds of processes if we are working with multiple projects at a time. One of the ideas that can be helpful is to diversify the contribution paths inside the projects beyond code. This means that we can work on documentation, on community, on websites, but this also can mean outreach, education, and a host of other tasks. If you're interested and you want to chat about it, let's talk. You can find me on Twitter at MelissaWM, or you can reach us in any of our official forums for NumPy. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining me today. My name is Rose Judge. I'm an open source engineer at VMware, and today I'm going to talk to you about how you can improve your Git commits in 2 easy steps. So who am I? As I mentioned, I'm an open source engineer at VMware, and part of my role there is to co-maintain an open source project called Turn. Turn is a container analysis tool written in Python that generates a software bill of materials for container images. The project originated at VMware with only one developer, my colleague Newcomer, and has since grown to have 2 maintainers and a small community of regular contributors. So when we as maintainers, and also we as contributors, right, we're contributors to our own project and maybe other projects as well. When we think of Git commits, I think that this cartoon might be what a lot of us think about. And while commits like this comic here may work in a personal repository or a private project, we want to try to avoid a changelog that looks like this for open source projects where we're trying to grow the project and the contributor base. And if you're looking at this comic like, ooh, I think parts of my changelog might look like this. That's okay. I don't want you to panic. This is not a talk designed to shame anyone. Instead, I'm going to focus today on how we can write better commits and how we can guide our contributors to also write better commits and why it benefits the project to do so. So when you're reviewing a pull request, what do you look for in a commit? What makes it good enough to merge? I would like to offer 2 simple criteria here that you can keep in your back pocket to make sure that the commits for your project are excellent. The first is that each commit only does one thing, and the second is that each commit message should be its own self-contained story. So what exactly do I mean when I say each commit must only do one thing? How do we determine what that one thing is, and how do we encourage other contributors to do the same? So at a high level, I want you to think of a commit like a recipe. If I were to show you this picture of a carrot cake and say, here are all the ingredients, I want you to go make this cake, would you know where to start without a recipe? Probably not, right? So think of a pull request, which is made up of 1 or more commits as the cake. And by breaking up each commit to only do one thing, you make your recipe easy to understand. So for example, one step in your pull request, quote unquote, recipe might be move function A from file A to file B, or remove function X, etc. I don't know if you've ever tried to follow a recipe where all the directions are crammed into one giant step, but if you have, you know how hard that can be to follow along. And the same goes for your changelog. If you're trying to cram all of your changes into one large commit, it's going to be confusing to understand what's happening there. Not to mention, if you encounter an issue in your code, your changelog is a list of steps that you can trace back to find where the problem was introduced. If you want to sift through your changelog to try to find a buggy commit, it's going to be much harder to do this when you're looking at giant commits versus smaller commits that each do one clear thing. But enough about cake. How do we start to break up our changes? So let's assume you have all your changes ready to go. You know, you've implemented the feature, you fixed the bug or whatever, and you're ready to open that pull request. When you start to break up your commits, think of writing that recipe. Each step, each commit does one thing, and all the steps put together tell a story of how to make your cake. And looking at this list, I don't want you to worry about memorizing it or anything. These points are not step-by-step requirements in any particular order. They're all meant to be very high level. So when you go about breaking up your commits or suggesting to contributors how they might break up their commits, you might start by isolating the non-functional changes. Maybe you're updating documentation, or maybe you're copying and pasting code from one file to another. Those would both qualify as non-functional commits, right? Things where no code is actually changing can be its own commit. And you might have several of these types of commits in a pull request. Next, you could look at your functional changes. So maybe you're adding a new function. That new function definition might be one commit, or you're renaming a function, maybe changing the name of the function throughout the code, even if it touches 10 files, is going to be another commit because it's just doing one thing. Another example might be if you're making changes to an API, and let's say that you're adding a function parameter. Instead of adding the parameter and changing all the code around it at the same time, your first commit might add the new parameter, and then the next commit might actually build the functionality around it. The third one here, if any part of your changes are related to code cleanup, each cleanup step should get its own commit. So oftentimes code cleanup will occur in parallel with new functionality or new features, but the cleanup itself should still be a separate commit from the feature implementation. And then my last note on this is breaking up your commits is that none of them should break the build, which just means that at each commit, the code should compile. So once you've separated out your commits so that each is only doing one thing, so using some of the criteria that I just discussed, the second step to improving your Git commits is writing an informative Git commit message. And there are lots of stylistic choices that you can make here that we won't have time to get into. But regardless of those style choices, you want to make sure each commit is its own self-contained story. So what type of information specifically should your commit message contain? When you write or you're reviewing a commit message, generally speaking, a good question to ask yourself is there enough context here to make sense of what's happening if someone looking at this had never seen the code? I think sometimes when we're writing commit messages, we think, well, I wrote this commit. Like if anyone has questions, they'll just come and ask me. But this is not particularly practical in open source, especially when you're working across numerous time zones, and providing enough context for your changes is really crucial. So when you start writing your commit message, first, summarize what changed in the subject line of your commit. This should be descriptive enough that someone reading it would have a general idea of what the commit is doing. And then the body of your commit message will be your explanation of why and in what context you're making the change. In order to help capture all the relevant information, you might also include links to relevant outside references, like a related discussion on a mailing list or a forum. You might add a reference to a GitHub issue or links to a ticket or bug report. And if you're including any type of URL or link, it's important that enough context exists in the commit message itself that the reader doesn't have to click on the link to understand your changes. Right? If you do include a link, it should be used as supportive evidence in addition to the summary of the relevant information. And there's a few reasons for this. One, the person reading your commit message might not have the time to follow a bunch of links. And two, the link might not exist forever. It is the internet after all. So your description should still make sense on its own without having to click on the link. If your commit is related to a bug fix, be sure to include any error messages in your code that the commit might be fixing. And this can be helpful later down the line if someone hits that same error message and tries to search the changelog for a fix. And then lastly, I put nice to have mention how you arrived at your change. And I added this because if you spend a bunch of time working on your change and maybe you tried a few iterations of your implementation before you arrived at your the final commit, it's just worth noting that in the changelog so that if someone else in the future goes to look at it, they can know what you did and not have to redo any work around it. So a good commit message boils down to a good story. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and all the relevant details are clearly summarized in context. And when I say self-contained, what I mean is to make sure that you're explaining any assumptions related to future or past commits in your commit message. So as an example, I've seen a series of commits where the first one says something like, see next patch for more information. And the trouble with that phrasing is that the next patch may not be what you think it is when it eventually gets merged into the project. So instead of saying that, you could say, instead of saying that, you could say, in order to enable X future functionality, we first have to add Y function in this commit or something like that. Okay, so I've unpacked a lot of information in the last 9 minutes about how to break up your commits and how to write a good commit message. And you might be thinking, well, I understand why this is required for a project like the kernel or Kubernetes, where there's thousands of contributors, but I maintain an open source project with 2 contributors or no contributors. And do I really need to do this? So I, of course, am going to say yes. Good commits that follow these 2 principles of each commit does one thing and each commit message is its own self-contained story are paramount to the sustained success of any project. More specifically, good commits enable support for a downstream stable version of the project. So the kernel is a great example of this. Let's say you have a stable branch and you only want to pull certain features from it. If your code is broken up into small commits, it's much easier to do that. If you're working with larger commits, you're going to have to pull in a bunch of additional code that you'll then have to maintain. Good commits also make future debugging easier. So if you encounter a regression in the future and you need to figure out which change caused the problem, working with smaller commits that only do one thing make it possible to find the exact point in time where something went wrong. If your commits are each doing 10 things, there's no easy way to test which of those 10 things broke the build. But if you have smaller commits, testing these individually can help isolate the problem. And then in any long-running project, there will come a time when code cleanup is required, and good commits help facilitate this cleanup. So for example, if you write in your commit message, this change was made to support X feature, and a year from now, you deprecate feature X, then you know you can safely remove that commit that said that it was for feature X. So in this way, good commit messages help keep your code lean and maintainable. Good commits are also a really easy insurance policy against attrition in your project. So if anybody contributing to your project suddenly leaves the community or leaves the company, and doesn't have time to work on it anymore, or wins the lottery and decides they're never going to write another line of code again, good commits make it possible for the project to continue even when the contributor is not around to ask questions to. Good commits facilitate working with folks in different time zones, especially with COVID. Like, this has become really important, right? Instead of having to ask someone to explain their changes, you can just refer to the commit, which should contain all the information you need to understand it. And then lastly, you can think of good commit messages for your project like you would good documentation for your project, in that if they're detailed and organized, new contributors are able to look into a project, get an idea of what's going on, and jump right in getting started without having to ask someone. So if at any point in this presentation you've thought to yourself, okay, I can see why good, structured, detailed commits are useful, and maybe we have a little bit of room to improve, right? Let's be honest, we all do. How can you start to put these changes into practice for the project you maintain? And it's really as simple as just starting today. Even if your project is a year old and you maybe haven't focused on commits in the past, start right now. Breaking up your commits so they only do one thing, and then writing that detailed commit message for it. And then also encouraging your contributors to do the same. So to help with this, put your commit requirements and expectations in your project documentation. And if you're a contributor to a project that doesn't have these expectations laid out, open a bug and encourage the project maintainers to write their expectations down. Especially if you're a maintainer for a project, having your commit requirements laid out will save you time when you get a new contributor to your project who opens a pull request with a bad commit. Instead of having to seem biased or giving a long-winded explanation all the time, you have something concrete that you can point to and say, please revise your commit in accordance with these standards. And when you are writing your own code, lead by example. Write the commit message that you want to read a year from now. Break up your commits in such a way that if you had to debug a patch set well into the future, it would be a pleasant experience. And finally, as a maintainer and a leader of a project, it's important to hold others accountable for their work, for their commits. And this can be hard when you have a really productive contributor that writes amazing code and you totally appreciate everything they contribute, but they write maybe sloppy commit messages. Sometimes the last thing you want to say is, please go fix your commits, and I really can't merge this until you do. Especially if you're working towards a milestone or it's like a really crucial bug fix. And it's tempting to just say, forget it, we'll worry about it next time. But know that holding others accountable for their work creates a culture of continuous improvement, which makes your project and the engineers who work on it better. So thank you all for your time today, and please reach out with any questions.
Hi there. I am Sumana Harihareswara of Changeset Consulting, and I'm not using any slides today, so you're free to take a few minutes to stretch, fold some laundry, what have you. So we have a pipeline for getting folks with coding skills to start or contribute to open source software projects, and that's great, and I'm glad. But I am pretty sure we do not have a pipeline to recruit or grow contributors with leadership and management skills. A maintainer of a widely used project is a manager, but since skilled managers are scarce in open source, we're seeing important projects stumble or even wither for lack of managerial work. At least this is what I've seen, and if you are seeing something to the contrary, I do want to hear about it. And I think this phenomenon is a factor in the open source sustainability problem. Knowing why this is happening can help us fix it. So in this talk, I will share a few hypotheses. One about the tooling we build and use, one about the effects of corporate involvement, one about changes in the problems that we're trying to address, and one about values and culture. And I'll talk about how we would check whether any of these are true. And I hope that considering this question will aid your efforts in focusing time and energy on things that will make a difference to project sustainability. So a little more about the problem that I see. Founders start projects but are unprepared for the managerial demands of maintaining things that other people depend on. And when legacy projects stagnate, contributors don't know how to take them over and stabilize them by solving common strategic, team, communication, workflow, and financial problems. And since they don't know how to rehab existing projects, individuals and organizations fork or start new ones, exacerbating fragmentation headaches. So what hypotheses do we have? Here's one, the tooling hypothesis. It used to be that if you were going to run an open source project, you had to make the tooling project yourself. You had to set up and administer, maybe even build your own bug tracker, source code repository, wiki, documentation site, tarball release repository. And now these are hosted services. GitHub, read the docs, PyPI. And that means that it's easier to start a project, but that also means it's easier to start a project without learning a lot about the value and capabilities of these platforms along the way. And then project founders are less equipped to use those things well. So that's one hypothesis. Here's another, the corporate involvement hypothesis or hypotheses. It changes things when companies get more and more involved in open source or hire people from open source. So one idea is maybe big companies hire the people who have managerial skills, they pluck them out and sometimes take them out of open source work entirely and leave behind the ones who don't have those skills. Or maybe open source would be failing worse without corporate involvement, and corporate engagement is actually sort of subsidizing the poor management that we would otherwise see. Possible. Here's another, the new problems hypothesis. What got us here won't get us there. We are currently trying to address new or unsolved or undersolved problems and areas in open source. Distributed and cloud computing, getting telemetry while protecting user privacy, user experience design that can stand up to the best that industry can offer, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and so on. And so in general, this hypothesis might say open source contributors have grown a certain median level of leadership skill, but we are now seeing cracks in the infrastructure because of the new loads they are trying to handle. And here's another, the values and culture hypothesis. Let's talk about our culture and values and how that affects contributor retention and promotion. We in open source recognize and promote people for the code they write, but we are bad at recognizing and valuing people for the managerial contributions they make. We treat glue work as invisible. So we don't attract or retain people with managerial skills or with an interest in growing in that direction. And I'd like to thank Amy Scavarda for some thoughts about some of these hypotheses. So how could we check whether any of these are right? Here's a few thoughts. We could talk with the scholars who were funded by the Ford and Sloan Foundation grants on critical infrastructure and sustainability to get their thoughts. We could work with those CHAOSS people, CHAOSS, the open source metrics working group, to construct a means to quantitatively measure maintainership actions happening within a project, and then find out what other attributes that correlates with, like whether or not certain particular projects or the domain areas that they're in were particularly influenced by companies. We could look for conversations in open source conversation archives from 15 years ago, let's say, to check what our forebearers were saying, whether they thought this was likely to already be a problem, whether they already saw a problem. We could try to offer explicit skills learning opportunities, training to contributors, existing contributors, to see whether people are interested and whether we can find ways to retain the people who take those offers as open source maintainers. My gut says the source of the problem, it's a mix of the corporate involvement and the values and culture hypotheses. So that is the basis that I am working from. I am currently working on a book outlining and teaching the skills that open source software maintainers need, teaching those skills to contributors who already contribute to open source but have never managed public-facing projects before. It'll be a textbook or a self-help guide for new and current maintainers of existing projects, what I call brownfield projects as opposed to greenfield, and it'll focus on teaching specific project management skills like initial project audit, grant proposal writing, bug triage, and meeting facilitation in the context of open source. And if you go to changeset.nyc under resources, you'll find a free sample. But let's talk further during the questions and answers session on Thursday. Which, if any, of the hypotheses that I've mentioned ring true to you? And how could someone check whether you're right, whether I'm right? Thanks.
Hi PyCon, thanks for having me. I'm Thibaud, my pronouns are he, him, and I'm a developer at Torchbox in the UK. Today I'm here to talk to you about building accessibility into open source projects, and in particular coming to you with our learnings from Wagtail. I'm a core developer of this CMS called Wagtail, built on Python and Django, and I also contribute to Django's accessibility team. So I'm here to share with you the learnings from those two projects. So Wagtail is a CMS that people use to build websites. When it comes to why we care accessibility, there are essentially two reasons. One of them is we want the Wagtail admin to be accessible to as many people as possible. And the other is we want the sites actually built with Wagtail to be as accessible as possible. So these are the two main reasons for end users. And then as a project, there are definitely a few more reasons. So the big one is legislation and procurement. Our clients and people who pick Wagtail as a CMS definitely have very specific expectations from projects, and they would pick one or the other based on requirements like this. So yeah, there's legislation in the US, in the EU, and really all around the world. It's not just those two countries. But one thing we do have going for ourselves is that all of those laws are based on the same standard called WCAG. WCAG 2.1 at the AA level being the most recent and widespread version of it. And yeah, it's not just Wagtail, obviously. It's not just CMSs. All types of online tools, apps, sites you build have to follow those same standards. And really, as developers, I want to make the point that this isn't just those projects. It's also the building blocks of those projects, the frameworks, the database modeling, the development tools, even the readmes have to follow those same standards. But yeah, I don't want this to be too negative either. So we'll look at some practical examples of where accessibility matters in the Python ecosystem in particular. So I went through the top 1000 Python packages on PyPI and thought I'd pick a few examples of where you might not think of accessibility, but actually there are very clear considerations to be had. So the first one is data science and alt text for data viz. As part of studying data, you will very likely have to visualize it at some point, and that might include producing images that you do want to be accessible to people who can't actually see the visuals. Of course, they might not get the whole interactivity and interaction. That might not be the point of your exercise, but just having some form of alternative text would be useful. So this example in particular that comes from Matplotlib, and the alt text they have defined in their example basically just restates the caption at the top of the chart, which is, well, definitely better than nothing. But to the right, I have an example of what it might look like for you to consider actually going through the whole data for people who can't see the visuals. And yeah, not saying this is always appropriate again, but definitely something to consider. And if you happen to work with one of those data viz projects, it's important, I think, for this to be considered in the docs, in the actual framework of how you create visualizations, and yeah, just making sure that this is taken into account. Another important part of the Python ecosystem is web development, with big frameworks that I'm sure you all have heard of before, and templating languages. And here as well, basically, even though those frameworks might not always be very opinionated about HTML, they do have, for example, code snippets in their docs that really should take accessibility into account. So it's very common for me to look at those documentations, code snippets, and see very basic HTML issues. So for example, to the left here, this is missing a lang attribute on the HTML tag. And yeah, a third topic in Python in particular is PDF generation. There are lots of those projects out there. And something that people might overlook is that even though the source for those PDFs is HTML, the PDF itself might not be structured at all, and it might not be usable by people with screen readers. So the key feature here that you have to look for is called tagged PDFs, and it's a requirement that very few of those projects actually have. Yeah, I'm trying my best not to have this be too negative. So just to finish on a more positive note, I wanted to showcase different ways you could foster those accessibility contributions on your own projects. The first thing to do is obviously to pick a target for what you support, with CAC 2.1 at the AA level being the obvious thing to start from. And just not stop at picking the target, but actually documenting it and documenting practical code review and testing steps. I think it's very important. I have added a few examples of this should you want to look into this further. And yeah, now that you have this target, actually doing some testing, there are lots of great automated tools out there. They won't find all of the issues, but they definitely find plenty enough to get going with. So I'd highly recommend looking into this. And this is an example from Django in particular, where we have this very big report that takes screenshots and logs all of the accessibility issues for different parts of the Django admin. And you can just look at this and get a sense of a snapshot of how Django itself is doing. And back on the Wagtail side, we tend to invest more into manual audits just because we have the expertise to do this. So these are definitely much more complex to put together, and I won't be talking about this much further, but if you're interested, I can definitely talk to that a bit more. And yes, for larger projects, I definitely recommend having a dedicated team for this of subject matter experts. So we have the example of Wagtail's team here. But yeah, for example, Jupyter Notebooks as well do have a team like this that looks after accessibility of the actual notebooks, which, as they are used in the classroom environment, is very important. So the last point I want to make really is that there are a few areas in software development, like security, for example, where open source leads the way and shows us how it's meant to be done, basically. And I really think accessibility could be one of those areas. It really is something that matters on all projects, no matter their size. And yeah, that matters to a huge number of people that developers often underestimate just the sheer size of the people who can benefit from this. And yes, there are well-defined standards and readily available tools. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll definitely be available later on to answer any questions.
First, we have Alex representing the project Pillow. Alex, would you like to say a few words?
Hey everyone, I'm Alex Clark, creator of Python Pillow, president of AClarkNet, a open source software consulting firm, and president and executive director of DC Python, serving the DC area's Python event needs. And thanks for having me. Nice to meet all the other participants and attendees.
Thank you, Alex. Next, we have Gina representing Octoprint.
Yeah, hi, I'm Gina Häußge. The last name is probably a bit of a mouthful for most people here. I'm the creator and main developer of Octoprint, which is the snappy web interface for 3D printers, and which is also, at least in the backend part, completely written in Python. Yeah, I've been working on this full-time now for 7 years, and 6 of those, I think, 5.5 of those fully crowdfunded. So I guess this is why I'm here today. Oh. I'm glad to be here.
Excellent. Wonderful. Thank you. Next, we have William from SageMath.
Hi. So I started SageMath in 2004 and funded it a lot via various methods. And I also started something called CoCalc in 2013. So I've been very involved with 2 open source projects over the years.
Thank you, William.
Yeah, I used to be an academic, like a full professor, and now I run a company, a small company. So I transitioned from academia to industry.
That's awesome. That's a story I've heard somewhere else before. Well, maybe we'll talk about that later. I'd also like to introduce everyone to Eunice from Open Teams.
Hello, everyone. I'm Eunice. I'm one of the co-founders and VP of partners at Open Teams. I was introduced to open source really through Open Teams. And Open Teams is an online marketplace to help connect users and creators of open source through services and different products. I'll be happy to chat more about what we're doing at Open Teams.
Thank you,
Thank
Eunice.
you for having me.
And next and last, we have Sumana from Changeset Consulting.
Hi, everybody. I'm Sumana Harihareswara, and I have a small consultancy called Changeset Consulting, where I focus on short targeted help to open source projects. And so I started to learn how to write grant proposals and get corporate donations as well to help fund open source software work for projects that I was working with. So I've put a few links in the chat. One is to a 10-minute talk that I gave at PyOhio last year on an intro to getting grant money for your project. I'm also affiliated with the project funding working group and the packaging working group in the Python Software Foundation, both of which work on different aspects of trying to get funding for Python related projects, in particular PyPI, pip, and the Python packaging world. And I've worked on that some, and we can talk about that more. Also, I just co-wrote a proposal to get some money from a US federal agency, the National Science Foundation, for Python packaging security, which will be administered through New York University. So I have done a lot of writing, often successful grant proposals to get money for open source projects. And I've also been working on getting money through corporate donations for important infrastructural projects inside and outside of Python, for instance, with projects like GNU AutoConf. And my independent consultancy is based in New York City, which is where I am speaking to you from.
Thank you, Sumana. Really appreciate it. And I'm going to say again, I've just been really excited to meet everyone today. So I guess we'll jump right into it. The first question I had for the panel, kind of focusing on the project maintainers to start, is what does funding success look like to you? You know, what does it mean to have a successful funding of an open source project from where you stand? William, do you have anything, or Gina? Anyone? Gina, go ahead.
Yeah. For me personally, I wouldn't focus so much on where the money comes from necessarily. So if it is an employment status, or if it is a successful crowdfunding campaign, or if it is stipends or whatnot. But personally, I think a project is successfully funded when the people maintaining it can actually do this maintenance and still have a roof above their head without having to do said maintenance during their after works hours at night, during weekends, during vacations and all that, but doing it actually as part of their work or even their full-time work.
But having that option to make it a part of your career or even make it your entire career.
Exactly.
Let's see, for me, funding success is very relative to the open source or to the project itself. So with SageMath, the goal of the project is to create a viable alternative to Mathematica, Maple, and MATLAB in Python. And I guess funding success would be to have enough funding to be able to do that. And and I'm sure that would involve, at least 10 people being able to work full time on various aspects of the software. Really, we haven't got there yet, for sure. And with CoCalc, it's different in that the goal is really to make it easy to teach using open source software via a web browser in classes collaboratively. And we could do a much better job in polishing the software and making everything available to users. And one project's funded by grants and the other project's funded by people paying the company. And so the funding situation with CoCalc looks a lot better because it's balanced nicely. Like we have enough funding to support the users, whereas the grant funded stuff is a little more difficult. And then sustainability is certainly what you very much want with, like when the funding feels sustainable, it feels a lot better and more successful. So to me, sustainability is probably the most important property of successful funding.
Right. So kind of expanding on that observation Gina made, that it's not just about having that successful career, but that successful careers can be made out of it over the long term.
Yeah, exactly.
I would maybe also add that it should be stable, because if I have to worry every single month about the next month, then I cannot really concentrate on doing my best job at maintaining or developing a piece of software. I constantly have to worry about whether I have said roof above my head next month as well.
Right. And the more time you're spending, say, selling or fundraising is time you're not spending writing code. Alex, did you have anything to contribute on this one?
There's two Alexes.
Oh, yeah. Whichever Alex, both, one, the other.
I'll go first. Yes, I've been asked this a lot, and I thought about it a lot. And the answer is that I have already achieved what I consider to be a very significant level of success in that I get paid, my team gets paid. There's 3 other people besides me, and we've all been getting a paycheck for 2 years or something like that with Tidelift. And Tidelift is responsible for this, and so I'm obviously a huge fan of theirs. I keep trying to get them to hire me full time. And that is the only thing I'll mention about success that is missing for me, and that is that I would love to do Pillow or open source full time. I currently have a company or 2 companies, and I have a job at NIH. I don't want to do everything in the world. I want to do one thing, and that's open source. So for success for me personally is that for the project, there's be hard pressed to find, I'm sure there's places to go, but for the project, we're doing pretty good. So thank you. Go ahead, Alex.
I'll pass my word to Cinema.
Thanks. So I actually recently gave a talk as part of the GitHub Office of the CTO speaker series on what would open source look like if it were healthy. And this is not just on the project level, right, but on the entire industry level. So I've just put a link in the chat, and there's a transcript there for those of us who sometimes prefer transcripts to video, despite the fact that you're here in a video right now because people contain multitudes. But I think that when you look at just sort of the industry as a whole, right, there's a massive imbalance in who does work and who gains profit. So part of what makes things sustainable is not just that individual laborers are making enough on a month-to-month basis to keep the wolf from the door. There's also an emotional sustainability aspect to it, which is not feeling like you're being super exploited by the fact that big companies are making a tremendous amount of money off of your work and not reciprocating in a way that you find commensurate. So that is something that I think is not really on a project by project level so much as an entire industry wide level.
Right.
But in terms of what success would look like, which is connected to health and sustainability and those sorts of things, I think we need to think not just about the life cycle of a software development project, right? But the life cycles of individual people within them. A healthy organism is one that has like new cells replacing old ones. A healthy ecosystem has, life and birth and death in it and so on. So part of what makes a project sustainable and successful is that resources can be employed, and those include time and money and digital infrastructure and so on, to help train up new apprentices to replace people who want to pass that baton to somebody else. And this is, in fact, something that money can be brought to bear to do. As we see, part of that can happen through things like the Google Summer of Code and Outreachy internship programs to help bring people in as contributors. And then one thing that I'm personally working on as well is helping turn contributors into maintainers, because I think that's a step that's often missing. And that's a place where funding can be brought to bear to help make projects healthier, is turning contributors into maintainers.
I like that you brought that kind of health and equity perspective to the discussion. It's very timely. I don't know if folks have been watching on Twitter. There was a discussion that broke out about Babel.js. And, Babel's very widely used for building up JavaScript packages. And while they are funded, they're not adequately funded, and they're starting to run out of cash. And they went on Twitter to ask for money, basically. And there was a bit of a brouhaha that erupted around that. And so these issues of equity and health really ring true, and it feels cyclical. Like every summer we have this discussion. So that's part of why I was so excited to be a part of this panel. I think one thing that stuck out to me while we were chatting was this panel seems very diverse in its ways of having obtained funding and how that funding is being applied. And so I wondered if we could explore that a little bit, and if the panelists could talk about how they've pursued funding, how they've obtained funding, and kind of describe their experience.
I can start. So I started by getting a grant when I was an academic to fund number theory research, and then diverted it to funding conferences on development of Sage. Like one of the first people I invited was Fernando Perez. And we did a lot of stuff, and that worked. And then I got a number of other grants where I started to involve computation. These are mainly from the National Science Foundation, involving pure math type stuff. I just posted a link with all the grant proposals. And then it worked pretty well for maybe, 8 years. And then I think they caught on, and then I suddenly stopped getting any grant I applied for. So it worked really well for a while. Fortunately, a bunch of Europeans got really into the software, SageMath, and they were able to get some enormous grants from the EU, which funded a lot of work until about a year or two ago. So for Sage, it's been lots and lots of grants from various people involved in the project, and just the project getting critically large enough that we can distribute the attempts to get funding from various government agencies. And then my second way of getting funding for CodeCalc was angel investors in a small startup company first, and then followed by people paying for the product. And then we have a sustainable revenue source where we have more money and recurring revenue per month than it takes to pay the 3 full-time people that work on the software. So, and we're growing at a certain percent each year. So it's really the kind of 2 different models. My goal with starting the company in the first place was that it would become profitable enough that I could donate it or somehow fund Sage development from the company later on, but we haven't quite got there yet. But we're getting close, maybe. I cross my fingers.
I really like that your story kind of straddles the two sides of this, and there's really multiple sides, but that nonprofit side and that for-profit side gives you a really unique perspective. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, the main surprise is how long each part of the story is. I mean, SageMath started in 2004, and the company I started in 2015 as a separate company, and it's 6 years ago and still very small compared to what I envisioned it would be like in 6 years. So sometimes the time frames, sometimes patience helps, I hope. We'll see.
Awesome. Let's see, for Eunice, could you maybe talk about how Open Teams is trying to address the funding of open source projects?
Yeah, definitely. I think Open Teams, and I just wanted to just mention a little bit on the success story that you mentioned earlier. I think for Open Teams, success looks like having full-time contributors and maintainers of open source projects, either having successful businesses around the open source projects, or actually getting full-time careers out of, just around the open source projects. And currently the way Open Teams does that is by working with the users, and a lot of the times large corporations who use these open source softwares. And working with them, again, we definitely understand that there are a lot of opportunities out there, from grants to open core model. But one of the biggest model that has worked for us and our co-founder, Travis Oliphant, which he started as I think an academia and became a businessman. One of the ways that he saw success for himself were by offering services and support around different open source projects. And that's one of the biggest way we help our founders get funding from these large companies. And we've seen a lot of success doing that in the past. So for us, it's really going to the big guys who are using these open source projects and figuring out how we can either offer them services or support around those open source projects. And we have different business models that we're using that definitely help towards the advancement of the actual open source project as well. I could elaborate more, but I wanted to make it, short and sweet.
Yeah, no, that was great. Thank you, Eunice. Let's see. So to summarize for Open Teams, it's about providing that marketplace to support kind of commercial endeavors around open source projects. That could be training, could be support, could be custom development, as well as perhaps other product offerings. Let's see. Gina, would you like to, do you have anything to talk about funding of your experience funding the development of Octoprint, or if there was funding?
Absolutely, yeah. So my path was probably a bit backwards from most people's. So it all started as a pet project, like the usual stuff that you do during your off hours and stuff, and then it got big, and I needed to find a way to keep this sustainable and healthy for me. So at this point, a large company that also happened to produce 3D printers approached me and basically told me, hey, we would like to fund you, like employ you full time, pay your salary, and you just do what you are already doing, but 100% of your time. And I was like, yeah, perfect. And then 2 years later, they ran out of money. And that was the point when I had to go the more normal way of trying to fund Octoprint's development through a crowdfunding approach in that case. So in my case, a combination basically of Patreon, PayPal, GitHub, sponsors, donor box, and the usual suspects. And to my utmost surprise, that actually worked. I cannot tell you how or why. My only explanation is that I already had like a critically sized user base that was convinced of the product that I was offering basically, and of the software that I was offering, enough that they were open to putting their money where their mouth is as well. And that has worked so far, but it only has worked so far to fund me. So the funding is at no way the level where I could say, well, I'm now going to create a corporation and employ some more people to help me and all that. So also in Germany, everything like that is a bunch of red tape that makes everything extremely difficult. But at the very least, it has successfully funded one single open source full-time maintainer in my person for since 2016 now. So that is pretty awesome and amazing. And sometimes I don't understand why, but hey, I'm taking it. I'm happy that it works.
That's a wonderful story. And I think whenever I hear that story of if I got hired full-time to work on the open source project, I get a little nervous because I'm so familiar with that capture problem where people get hired and they get to work on it for a year, but then now the company has an employee, so they work on company projects, and now we've lost a critical maintainer.
That is actually something they try to do with me as well, but I always was like, hey, we had an agreement here, and what am I supposed to tell all the people that depend on my work, And I also have to say, in hindsight, I prefer the current mode more. It is way more stressful. It is way less secure, maybe. But on the other hand, I don't have this between chairs feeling anymore, where on the one side I have an employer that I have to report to, and on the other side I don't know how many thousand users, and not necessarily they don't necessarily both want the same thing. On the other side, now I have 100,000 or something employers, so that is also maybe not the best, but
Gina,
it can be a little bit stressful.
I have a question, Gina. What country are you based in?
Germany.
Okay, so you have healthcare no matter what.
Yeah, more or less. So everything here is, I have a basic level of healthcare. So it's not like in the US where I would face, I don't know how many $100,000 of personal invoices when I need to get a tooth pulled or something like that. But on the other hand, they make it extremely difficult here for people to be self-employed, with insurances that are mandatory and tax laws that are extremely difficult to navigate through. So the first thing that I pretty much got when I went down this route was to get myself a tax consultant, because without one, I was seeing myself in jail within the next 2 years. Simply because everything is so complicated, not because I wanted to do something wrong, but just because I feared. So no matter what I do now, I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing. Also being self-employed in Germany and getting crowdfunding for work that you give away for free so people can take it, whether they pay you or not, is something that is completely foreign of a concept here. And there is absolutely no precedence for that. So I'm currently also in the funny position that my local tax people are
unsure. For instance, you're going to be the deciding case if it goes to court.
I have a question.
If push comes to shove, maybe, yeah.
Does anyone know what is the country in the world that is actually most hospitable to this kind of a person? Is it Estonia, maybe? In terms of making it really easy to be self-employed and to crowdfund income for something that is not a service you are selling. It's just something you're giving away. Does anyone have a sense about this? And the reason, of course, I bring it up, Gina, you have a basic level of healthcare. You're in Germany, is because so much of the time, I think I've seen that people who have just started thinking about funding and open source and sustainability and maintainers think, okay, well, you turn on a spigot, and even if somebody just gets a certain amount of money per month, that's, let's say, a quarter of what they need to live on, that'll still make a difference to them, right? It'll still be helpful. But at least in the United States, until that amount of money is at an amount where the person can feel okay about switching from a full-time employment job that comes with healthcare benefits to something else where they believe that on an ongoing basis, they'll be able to not only support their daily expenses, but also deal with healthcare, with buying health insurance, let's say on the open government exchange, and that they believe they'll be able to do that for multiple years in the future when those prices are really volatile. There's a discontinuity where up until you get to that level of funding, it's really, really hard to actually have that amount of money change how much of this person's time is actually going to be available to work on open source. At least this is my understanding and my experience. I think if you were to survey people and say, you're a maintainer, where are you? Are you physically, for instance, are you in the US? And how do you get your health insurance? Is it through you being an employee someplace versus you being a dependent, a spouse, a veteran, somebody who gets their healthcare through some means other than their employer? That like those people who currently are full-time wage earners who get in the US, who get their health insurance through a full-time, what we call W-2 job with an employer, it's going to take a lot for those people to be able to switch to some kind of independent job. And so that's where if places like OpenTeams, TideLift, Patreon, GitHub sponsors, whatever the thing is, if they actually could start providing health insurance, that would be a huge game changer, right?
That leads.
I agree with that.
It leads kind of naturally into a question that I had wanted to ask today, which was, what do you need your funders? And it's a two-way question. What do the funders need the projects to know and the maintainers to know? And what do the projects need the funders to know about their situation and how things are made successful? And I, as an entrepreneur, I agree with what you're saying intensely, Sumana, that healthcare in the United States is one of our significant barriers. And then I heard from Gina that that's not as significant a barrier in Germany. It's more that there's this difficulty working under this new approach, that it isn't well covered within the German tax system. What are other things that, as funders or as project maintainers, you need the other side of this funding equation to know?
And I'll break in just to remind people orally, hey, there is a chat here in Zoom. Please feel free to put your audience questions for us there too.
Absolutely.
Damn, I just had something on the tip of my tongue, it slipped past again.
Well, I might poke at some folks, maybe Eunice, is there something you would like project maintainers or project contributors to know?
Yeah, I think the way, again, this is one business model that we think of at OpenTeams. And I've heard a lot of people say that, for example, Gina, she said, she's been able to raise enough money just to employ herself. At OpenTeams, and the reason why we call ourselves teams is because we believe open source is built as a team and not as an individual. And we want to help open source founders actually build businesses around open source projects, around their projects, if they're willing to offer some amount of services, to the people who are using the open source software. And OpenTeams helps a lot on the business side. So if you're just an engineer and you don't understand how to start a business, grow revenue, find sales, put the HR and actually get insurance from employers, OpenTeams can help you do that. So that's one of the benefits that we do offer at OpenTeams, because a lot of the people who build OpenTeams were contributors in the past. And they understand that, like how to start a business out of open source. And that's one of the things that, we want any founder interested in actually building a long-term career or a successful business around a project to reach out to us, and we'll be happy to help.
But Alex Clark or Alex Seguera or William, what would you like, if you're as a funder or as a fund, an entity that needs funding, what would you like the other side to know?
Actually, I wanted to tell my funding story answer before I forget it.
Absolutely,
and,
please.
It is that I was an open source consultant as of the mid-2000s, so I knew what getting money for stuff was. And I started Pillow in 2010 and did it myself for 3 years. And then in 2013, I asked the PSF for money, and they gave it to me. That was for Python 3, for Pillow to support Python 3, and that was the turning point for widespread adoption. And then I asked them for money again a few years later, I think, for the domain that we use. But then in 2019, Tidelift, a guy named Keenan Sulzik, I think, from Tidelift approached me about funding. And so I wasn't actively looking for it at the time, but it was a welcome thing. And now I will think about that next question.
I will say, you know, in Open Teams, we've had the opportunity to speak with some of the folks at Tidelift, and I've been excited at the innovation we've seen in the industry in the past 2 years. And so it's great to meet someone who has a success story through Tidelift, because, you know, there's so much room in the industry for innovation and different ways of doing things. So we're just cheerleaders and really excited to hear about your success.
Yeah, they flew us up to Boston, my wife and I, and we met with them. And this was for, they brought all the lifters together for an event, and it was awesome. So nothing but, you know, good things to say about them.
That's cool.
I've remembered in the meantime.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, so one thing that struck me when I was looking for ways to fund Octoprint, and also when the occasional sponsor broke away or something like that, was a lot of the, let's say, fundraising platforms that are explicitly targeting open source projects are, or at least it felt to me like that, are primarily targeting open source projects that are more like libraries, stuff that gets used by other developers, stuff that gets used by companies in their development subdivisions and stuff like that. And I always felt a bit left out there as the maintainer of an end user facing piece of software, that people like a grandpa, for example, who uses a 3D printer to print, I don't know, model planes or something, installs on their own. So that those are not people who necessarily navigate in these structures. They don't understand the concept of libraries. The companies that use my software might possibly, but then they are also, they will probably also not feel spoken to by the kind of language that is often used. So for example, I look primarily at Tidelift, and I also think at Open Collective, and all that was always focused at like empower the projects that power you or something. And that was always, that I mean, I do empower people with my software, and I don't say my because I don't consider it like an open source property of everyone, but mostly just it is primarily me who's working on that. Also because of the end user thing, because most of the people who use Octoprint cannot contribute back to it in code form. So the maintenance usually just lands on my shoulders. Where was I?
Right.
So those
it's about libraries.
Right.
And that is just not me. So also I think also of projects like, for example, GIMP or Blender, who I mean, Blender is fully funded and does an amazing job there, but still I think there is some room to grow there, maybe for the funders or the fundraiser platforms to not only look at the libraries and at the building blocks that bigger end user facing or internal software is built from, but also at that software as well that is shared under open source licenses.
Right. You're kind of, if we use, these aren't the right terms, but it's the difference between like a B2B business and a B2C business.
Exactly.
Like your software is directly to the end user who may not be technical. And
often isn't.
Writing code.
Yeah.
I want to point out here, there are some incredibly useful archetypes put out by Open Tech Strategies, a consulting firm that I sometimes do some work with in coordination with Mozilla, and I've just put a link in the chat. These are basically 10 basic categories of different kinds of open source projects, including libraries, end user, things like VLC or Firefox, right, that end users use, things that are very much like, okay, there's a single business that really stewards this one project, like MongoDB, or something like that. And then there's sort of the business to business consortium stuff. There's and these different archetypes, these different categories of open source project. Knowing which of these you're in helps you understand what are the forces at play for how many stakeholders are there? Who is going to care enough about this that they might actually be willing to pony up? Who do you kind of have to listen to? How will governance work? And things like that. It's really interesting, Gina, that you mentioned that it felt like a lot of the conversation was about libraries, because I think part of what we're seeing there is a sort of pendulum swing where, what was it, 4 years ago, it feels like, Nadia Egball's report Roads and Bridges came out. That got a lot of people's attention, along with, you know, the Heartbleed issue, the left pad issue and stuff like that, on, oh no, like the infrastructure of our entire industry is much wobblier than we thought because of the libraries issue. And so the security, we need to secure these things response, you know, focuses on stuff like that. And that's what you're seeing with the new open source security foundation and stuff like that. And so that, I feel, was a pendulum swing away from, you look at like the age when things like, you know, when Patreon started and when Kickstarter was being used, it was much more about applications and hardware that end users would be interested in, right? So that's like where a lot of funding attention went. So it's interesting to hear that maybe the pendulum swing of sort of our conversations about this has gone so far in this direction that it's actually made things harder for things like Octoprint. And it would be good to have a more holistic conversation in the different spaces where that's appropriate about the different archetypes.
Just a quick note about Patreon. The problem with platforms like Patreon and Kickstarter, and especially Kickstarter, because it's like you fund one thing and then that's it. And if I continuously maintain something, that's it. That's not something that I can just get money once and then I'm done. And with Patreon, when I started back in 2016, at least back then there wasn't even a category for software. So they didn't really have this whole ecosystem or this whole bunch of maintainers that might use this platform as a platform, as a funding platform for their projects on their radar at all. I don't know if this has changed. I'm still listed in the writing category for some reason. I never put myself in there, but hey, I mean, in some way I am writing. And yeah, so that always made me feel a bit lost until stuff like GitHub sponsors came on the plan, because Patreon didn't really understand what I was doing, and Tidelift and Open Collective and such, maybe they did understand what I was doing, but I was in the wrong target group. So that is still a bit of a problem. As I said, GitHub sponsors fills this gap a bit, but it's always good to have more options.
Oh, that really we've had a really good discussion, though. I think, Alex, did you say did you have something to say?
So as I was sitting here, it came to me what my answer was to the question about what do funders need to know, and that is that it's not a solved problem. So Tidelift's business plan, or what do you call it? Their value proposition, I find super compelling, which is, in layman's terms, to be the Red Hat of open source software. So if Red Hat set up, you know, tech consulting and had people install open source and then they supported it, that's where Tidelift is headed with the software, not the operating system, but all the software. So they're selling, you know, support for all of it. So, and that's a huge thing to solve, and it's not solved. So funders, you know, compete with Tidelift. I think their business model is a winner.
There are two things, if I can step in too and talk to this question. The first thing is that in the past 2 years, I think something has changed, because this panel itself is the thing I want people to be aware of. There are several people here who have made careers out of contributing to open source software and under a variety of approaches, either through grant writing or through starting their own consultancies, or collecting money through different funding mechanisms like Patreon and GitHub sponsors. And I think that's really remarkable. And the thing to point out is that there are mentors out there for you if you're maintainers. On the funder side, it's to know that if you are looking to contribute funding, there are a variety of ways to engage with the broader community. And you know, you just kind of have to think about what is the impact that you want to have, and what is it what value do you hope to derive from your funding? And then just to kind of put a plug in for Open Teams and Tidelift, there are companies out there that can help the maintainers. We have our own models, but I think there's this really big opportunity. We like to think of Open Teams as like the Amazon .com for open source. So, if you've got a product around open source, we want to sell it. And we want to help you find your customers and get connected with them. To Gina's point about the episodic donation, one of the models that we bring on the open team side is the notion of a subscription for services, support, training, what have you, so that there are recurring revenue streams so that people can plan and it can have a reliable business built around their projects.
If I may just hook into that, one thing that I always hear so often when it comes to funding open source and what the people funding open source get back in return, there is always stuff like services, custom development, consultancy, things like that. And what I am often also still lacking or missing in the discussion is the fact that they get ongoing maintenance. I mean, this is the main work that we do as the maintainers. Frankly, I would not even have the time anymore to do some sort of side gig, like providing some service or some custom solution. I have turned down requests by companies who say, hey, we need a plugin for Octoprint that does this, simply because I cannot justify spending this time on that when I know that I have these huge to-do lists on Octoprint and get funding from people to do actually work on that. So what I'm trying to get at is that I think it would be great and all of open source and especially the open source maintainers would really profit from the fact that if people out there and especially companies out there would understand that the return that they get for funding open source is the return they already have. It's not something they get on top of that. I mean, maybe something like placing a logo or something that is somewhere. That is stuff that is definitely not going to rip a hole in my schedule. But all in all, it's important to understand that the work that we are already doing, that needs to be funded too. It's not always the add-ons that we can also provide.
And it's about risk mitigation. They're paying. It's like paying an insurance policy. Go ahead, William.
Yes.
Sorry.
I think I kind of came up with an answer for at least SageMath, which I think is interesting just because it's much different than the other projects that we're talking about. So SageMath needs three things and they kind of come from different organizations. So one is we have GitHub sponsors donations and that helps pay for hosting. And we do need like a few $100s a month for various hosting costs. And then a second thing, we have workshops a lot, maybe 10 per year. And those are they're very easy to fund in academia. There's just lots of resources available to run a workshop for about a week and get the funding for it. They're not cheap, but we've had over 100 so far. And so it's just provably very easy to do. And the third thing that we really need, right, the project really needs is to be able to take roughly maybe 10 or 15 at once in various places, academics, and have them be able to focus on working on implementing some algorithm or class of algorithms for a semester. So these are people who have written a lot of research papers. They have a PhD, probably. They're subject matter experts. And there are only three or four people in the world that could implement this sort of algorithm. And you really want to basically buy out their teaching for one semester and do that a lot over the years, and have some sort of board set up that allocates the funding for that. This third thing, it's barely happened at all. We've very occasionally had this happen, but it's what we need maybe 100 times as much as we've had so far. It's pretty expensive, but it's nice because you get the advantage of some extreme subject matter experts who are proven to have the right skills because they've already contributed something. And there's also a lot of infrastructure in place already. You don't have to worry about their health insurance or where they're, like a lot of the extra overhead of hiring them is taken care of by their academic institute already, but you need money. And it's exactly the kind of money it's been very, very hard to find and frustrating to find. And sort of my goal is, at least long-term, is that there'll be a company that can provide money that funds this sort of work. But it's really these three different things. And we've had a big gap in the third, which is funding people, not like for their entire job being working on Sage. It's just that it's their job for one semester or one summer periodically. And it's extremely hard to find the money for it, unfortunately. For me, at least.
William, let's talk.
Cool.
We do have a question from the audience. Let's see. The question is, as Gina says, paying for something you already have, why would they need to pay? So how can we show them that funding is the way to go, else we'll drown and the software goes along with that?
That is actually a good question. In my case, I think I've made it quite clear to people that I am happy to work on this full time. I will do my best to keep moving it forward. But if I cannot do this as my full-time job and actually live from it, then I will find a different job that pays my bills. And that means I will not work on this project anymore. And apparently that scared people, or I don't know. But the point is really what Sumana already said, that for most people, it's also a bit of insurance. They want this software to continue to improve. They want this software to continue to evolve. And a lot of the people also know how to navigate a bug tracker enough to post and basically to swamp the projects with feature requests. And how do they think the feature requests will get implemented, on what time, right? If you just wait for a pull request for a feature request, that also needs to be merged. That usually also needs to be reviewed. Bugs have to be ironed out. You get tech debt that needs to be taken care of, things like that. And especially if you primarily work with pull requests from various sources, you get a lot of tech debt because of different ways of coding things and people not knowing specifically what kind of side effects certain changes have and all that. So this is basically, what they basically get is not necessarily just the code, but they get the ongoing maintenance of the code. And that is only insured if you actually make sure the people doing that can continue to do that. And that is something that a lot of people don't understand, but at least I have made good experience with explaining this to people and telling them, listen, this is how things are, this is how things work. Code doesn't grow on trees. So the fact that you have that now in your hand means someone had to grow that code, and that someone needs to eat too, you know? And if you put it into very into very simple concepts, it seems to click with people even who have never touched any line of code before. So yeah.
So this is a question of marketing and motivation. I'm really, really glad to get to hear Gina's experience with this. There's always going to be some quantity of humans who are utter cheapskates and would prefer never to pay for anything that they can get for free. Okay, let's just set that aside as a given. And then there are some quantity of humans who are extremely generous and altruistic and like funding other people. And even if you just put a donate button out and you don't do any clear marketing around it, some people are going to click that and give you money. All right, fine. Let's talk about the middle, right? Which is people who do respond to persuasion of some kind. Yeah, one of the things, so Jeffrey just said in chat, it's like the same reason that you pay for Linux, but you can download it for free, certain kinds of convenience, and maybe wanting to put, a little bit of insurance down that this thing that is convenient to you is going to continue to exist in the future. I really have a lot of problems with Nadia Egball's latest book, Working in Public. I wrote extremely many marginal comments about things that I disagreed with, especially in like the second half of the book. Anyone here who also read it, I'm happy to talk with you about it. But a thing that she does get is, remember that for a lot of people, paying for a thing that you use that's made by individual humans is this relational thing, where the same way that, a person might pay for a ticket to go see a concert, when there's, they could listen to that music on streaming or on CD or something like that. Part of what they want is a little bit more of a personal connection with that artist. Or people want the sense that perhaps there is a chance they'll be noticed. Yeah, Alex. Okay, yeah. I see that you also have the book. Nadia Egball went basically to work for GitHub, where I'm assuming she was at least in some way related to the fact that GitHub sponsor started. She works in other places, and now she works at Substack, right? And so I think there's this through line in thinking about, there are things like library level infrastructure where the payment methods are probably there's going to be a lot of government, business, and similar like large scale investment in libraries type stuff. And then when it comes to things where individual end users are making a thing, that are using a thing, I'm going to guess there's going to be some more interest in people paying because they like having that personal connection with the creator, the artist who makes it. Right? There's also this, this is a marketing thing, and humans like being connected to other humans in many cases.
I can agree. I can totally mirror that or agree with that, because that's also the experience that I've made. So getting this personal connection going and telling people, showing people who I am, reaching out to people, just being more present already does a lot of things in the funding department, basically. Because if they can put a face to your work, then they are, there is this personal connection now. There is no longer this. There's maybe 1 or 12 or 15 developers somewhere sitting in a dark basement, probably employed by a company or something. No, there's this one girl sitting over in Germany hacking away on Octoprint, and then suddenly, okay, maybe she could use some coffee money or something.
I do want to mention something quickly since we're running out of time. One of the things that Open Teams do, again, we don't just work with different maintainers that are interested in offering services. We actually work with maintainers that just want to maintain a project. And what we do is we communicate with the company. Maybe let's say one company is interested in seeing the project staying alive and moving it forward. We actually figure out what other companies might be interested in keeping this project alive, and actually get into, okay, let's say we want to fund a 2 to 4 year, lifetime of this project. And we will require maybe like 1 million to sustain 2 developers to work on this project full time for the next 2 years. And we actually help the founders put those agreements together and help them fundraise for that. And again, our strategy is a little bit different because we don't go to individual people in the community. We actually target companies that are using the software. I just wanted to point that out.
Oh, and I'm always on the lookout for new product ideas. So I was listening very carefully to your story, Gina. So I would love to talk with you more, at some point. Yeah. Well, Eunice, it's after 5. I guess I should hand this back to you. But before I do, I really want to thank all the panelists. I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope you did, and I hope the crowd did as well.
What a great conversation, and so much food for thought. I'd like to thank everyone for joining this discussion. Please feel free to continue the conversation on Twitter. Use the hashtag Maintainer Summit. And tomorrow, at the same time, at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, we will be hosting a Q&A session with the presenters of the talks, which will be moderated by Alexandra de Sequeira, who was helping us with the chat today. So I hope to see you tomorrow. Take care of yourself, and if you can, of others too. Have a good evening. Enjoy PyCon, and see you tomorrow.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
How we research the leadership gap for legacy projects.
Thank you, Sumana. Hey.
Hi, my name's May. I'm the co-founder of Virtual Peer, which is a group coaching platform supporting people with their career and leadership goals. And I also have a background in organizational design development and strategic change management. The talk that I presented was on burnout. So looking forward to hearing your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, May. Thibaud?
Hello, I'm Thibaud. I'm from the UK. I work as a developer at Torchbox, the people behind the Wagtail CMS that you might have heard of. My main open source involvement these days is as a core developer to Wagtail and member of the accessibility team for Wagtail, and more recently being involved with Django's accessibility team. And yeah, that's me.
Thank you, Thibaud. Brian?
I'm Brian Douglas. I go by BDouggie on GitHub, and that's my employer. I work at GitHub. my talk was about GitHub Actions and how you can leverage them in your Python projects. So I'm looking forward to hearing if you are using them, if you have questions. Happy to field them. Also, I do chat with a lot of open source maintainers too as well, and maintain my own projects. The one project, the big one that you probably haven't heard of, is called Open Source. It's pretty small.
Thank you, Brian. Juanita?
Hello, I'm Juanita. I'm based in Colombia. I am a developer for Spyder IDE. I work for Quantsite. And last year, I've been doing docs work mainly and community work as well. I've been trying to come up with new ideas for Spyder documentation to be better and more friendly, I guess.
Thank you, Juanita. And Melissa?
Hi, I'm Melissa. I am based in the south of Brazil. I've been working at Quantsite also with Juanita since the beginning of 2020, and I've been doing some work on NumPy on both documentation and some code, and also doing some community work for NumPy, which is what my talk was about.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you all. Inessa, is there any questions? Or
I don't see any questions in the chat yet. And I
So-
strongly encourage our audience to get active and please ask questions.
So, Cheuk, in your talk, you told us you had to be a detective to solve one of the issues you presented while creating a specific release, right? So what kinds of tools do you use for that when you need to solve this kind of problem? I mean, how to solve these possible errors in the release when this happens? And I personally depend a lot on GitHub Actions or Travis for that kind of work. Is there something, some kind of walkthrough you would like to recommend?
Yeah, I just talk about my experience of like I'm just a bit like stupid that, you know, sometimes like you panic, right? Like you'll be like, oh, it was working fine a moment ago. Why is now doesn't work? And especially when you're releasing and it's on a Friday night, you're like, you want to go out to meet your friends, have a drink, and then you're stuck there, right? I have to release it. And so yeah, I don't have a special tool. Like usually you can just see your trace. You know, if you look at the GitHub action or your Travis, like there's also the log. You see, oh, what went wrong, and then like, what does this error come from? And so yeah, like I think I was just overlooked because at that time the problem came from pip tools, which is actually one of my talks environment dependencies. So it's not exactly in my requirements doc text. So that's why I kind of overlook and like doesn't know what went wrong and try to like kind of go through loops of things. And I like also kind of, I was stupidly opening an issue on talks saying like, oh yeah, it's broken because of talks, but it's not. So and I was like, oh, sorry, I do love talks, don't be angry at me. And you know, but yeah, I don't know how is it an often thing? I don't know whether other maintainers can let me know that. Is it like something that you have experienced before that you kind of like, oh, why my CI is broken? It works on my computer, why it doesn't work on the on GitHub Action, you know? So
Yeah.
yeah.
So that's something I'd like to hear from Brian as well. So I'm terrible and afraid of dealing with GitHub Actions in that sense, you know. So these days we're helping a project specific to migrate stuff from a proprietary platform. Yes, that one, you know, the work helmet one, the mustache one. So to GitHub Actions, right? And there are lots of pain and suffering involved. And so do you have any tips on something that could help in the transition? And also on the choice stuff, on how can we navigate when we're trying forensics on GitHub Actions, for instance?
Yeah, so I would say that even GitHub ourselves, we took a while to migrate to Actions because we were using other services as well. So I guess to start off, I mean, I usually take like a small piece and start there. But let's say like in the context, I don't want to assume like Django, so maybe I'll just say Python. Actions does have the ability to run stuff. It's a full-on VM, so you could leverage Docker as well if you wanted to. It doesn't get in the way if you're not using it or if you are using it. So if you're able to get your CI to run locally, leveraging Docker, that could get you as like a nice little step in the right direction. And I use Docker, replace Docker with something else. And I'm pretty sure that would be fine as well. But well, something else that does containers. So that could be a stepping stone for that. I've chatted with a couple different projects. I think the one that everybody that I could say out loud is the Rust project. And they had a lot of like infrastructure and stuff like that that was that was cumbersome to migrate. So it just really comes down to like, can you get it in some sort of container first, and then you're good to go? Or sorry, can you get it in a container first, and then you'll be good to go to transition? Now, I'm talking about the large projects. If you're a small project and you are just sort of, you point and click, added a travis.yaml file, for the most part, most of that transfers over because we leverage YAML as well. So there's a lot of great error messages in the action logs that will hopefully point you in the right direction. We also have a community forum as well, which a lot of our open source maintainers leverage. And the PM team, the engineers, and the support team all circle the GitHub.community forum. So the best place to actually ask your questions, and it would be super helpful, is there. If not, at least ask it in Stack Overflow, and someone will find it and help you out.
Nice. Thank you, Brian. So any speakers on more options in GitHub Actions or opinions, forensics, so on?
I think there's a good question in the chat that says, is there any way to run GitHub Actions locally? And I've had a similar question because sometimes you don't want to have to keep like re-pushing your PR to get the action to trigger to see if like that's going to work that time. So I am also very curious about that.
Yeah, so my name on my Zoom is bdougie. If you went to youtube.com/bdougie, I've got 3 tips for debugging actions. It's a video to answer this question, so I can just point there in case I miss some steps. But I do the Docker way. If I could run it locally, I'll just run it locally and then see it run. If you, there's 2 other ways. Another way you could actually, there's a GitHub action called tmux actions. So if you needed to jump into the action runner that's hosted on GitHub and see exactly what's happening, you can do that. Just open up a shell. Another way is there's another tool called ACT. The GitHub handle is Nectos. Anyway, the video points to it. There's a link. From there, there's that tool, and you could run anything that runs on pull request or push on demand. So instead of pushing a commit, you can debug that way. I mentioned there's a lot of different ways. So sorry, the debugging story in Actions is not as clean. It's something that we've been working on. We've been researching and chatting with open source maintainers about. You could also manually run workflows. So I have a bunch of actions that run whenever I cut a new release. I don't want to cut a new release if it fails. So I actually have a webhook that's called Workflow Dispatch that I add to all my actions that I can just manually hit the button in my action logs, and it just reruns the entire thing again with a clean cache too as well. It starts from fresh. Finally, I just want to mention one thing. Sorry, I just happen to work with this feature a lot. The CLI.github.com, you can now run actions locally from your machine, as well as watch the logs locally from your machine, and then step into the other things I mentioned locally from the machine that the infrastructure you're working from. So in case you happen to be tmuxing in other places.
Nice. Thank you, Brian. Anyone else? Any more questions on that line? Okay, so Rose, I'm a very slow learner, and these days I'm learning through someone else's code. So I really like your ideas on how to prepare these better informative commits, you know? So I feel I'm kind of do some of that already because of other experiences, but let me pick your brain on 2 things. First, how do you find the balance between a commit message that's incomplete, missing information, and a message that's more like an odyssey than anything, you know? And also, how can we ask that from our contributors without scaring them away? Because is this something that we could implement gradually, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think gradually is kind of the only way to go, because especially if these are not requirements that you already have in your that your contributors expect of your project, then you kind of have to ease into it. So how to find the balance between not scaring off your contributors and wanting to still have enough information in the commit message. As maintainers, I feel like part of the responsibility you'll be carrying a little bit more of the weight at first. So for example, in our project Turn, I co-maintain it with one other person. We will, if we see somebody, especially who's new to the project, and we say, they open a pull request and it doesn't maybe have as much information as we'd like. Two things that I would suggest. One, I mentioned this in the talk, but having those requirements for your commit messages laid out. So you can have some examples of like what you'd like a pull request to look like, or what a commit message to look like just in terms of format. Maybe like we capped the title at 50 characters and then the body at 72. So just stuff like that. But then also sometimes we'll maybe say, hey, like, could you reformat your commit message to look, in accordance with these standards? And if it's been if they come back and they try to do that and maybe it's still not totally what we'd like, sometimes I'll just write the commit message for them and say, like, could you use this? And some of that work, that is putting more work on the maintainers, but it's also a good place to kind of set an example and also take some of the burden off of especially first-time contributors who maybe don't want to keep iterating through to get the perfect commit message. So, and then it's also just shows them how, in the future, like, gives them an idea of what you're looking for. So it's was a two-part answer, but hopefully that answered your question.
Thank you, Rose. So any more questions or experiences from the speakers on how to deal with nice commits? How do you receive nicer commits for your projects?
When you say how do you receive nice commits, you mean how to encourage better commits?
Yeah, let's go that way. So how do you help your contributors to write better commits for you or for the project in the future?
I think at least for Wagtail, what tends to really help is to be very clear on issues that if you expect people to have some sort of plan ahead of making the commits, they reach out to you, because then you get to actually talk them through the whole thing, and they are just much more likely to have a better experience if they can already talk to you before they actually write any code. It helps their onboarding quite a bit, and yeah, it's just much clearer for them what to do, exactly what you're expecting, I think.
Mm-hmm. So what kinds of tools do you use for these maintainers? Are there any tools that could be used to automate these commit messages standardization, like a commit message linter? Is there something like that we could use?
Yeah, I think there are lots of tools out there. We actually wrote just a custom specification that just does a quick check on the commit, but I know Gitlint is another project. And I'd be curious what other maintainers use to enforce those commit message standards as well.
I want to also point out, so this is part of a larger item of, in general, how do you include and teach and encourage volunteers whose contributions aren't where you want them to be, right? I wrote a blog post with several suggestions about how to do this, divided into a few different sections. There's teaching people to improve their code and their software engineering practices. There's dealing with the poor contributions themselves. And then there's sort of redirecting them, right? In some cases, it might be best to use those contributors' knowledge and curiosity to improve the project in other ways. So I've put a link to that in the chat in case people want some of those other alternative approaches.
Thank you, Sumana.
Yeah, I was gonna say I love that. I'm gonna read this blog post and this list of things. I actually was encouraged when I was chatting with the Pandas project. They had an issue where it's the other end of the contribution where they just have a lot of issues, and it's very hard to know who's working on what and how you can get started. And they do have a guide, but sometimes people don't read the guide. So they actually I'll drop in the chat. They actually leverage a GitHub action. Sorry, this is what I love talking about, to basically allow people to assign themselves to issues. And then they have another script to basically go through and check on folks to see if there need to be help. So it just leaves a comment, kind of like Stalebot, but not Stalebot where it closes the issue. It's sort of like prod bot. I don't know what they call it, but basically like, hey, are you okay? Do you need any help and stuff like that? And that sort of gets the conversation started. And they just continue to redirect people to an issue. So if you want to work on something, open the issue first, and then assign yourself to the issue. And then they can sort of like do the triaging through helpful with bots and stuff like that.
Nice. Okay. Thanks, Brian. So more questions on that? More input on that, speakers?
I think it might sound a bit old-fashioned, but to me, there's not much that can beat talking to people directly. Unfortunately, that's still like the thing that works the best. If you have the time, if you can put the time in, like do just make sure to create those connections with people, whether that's some kind of event you're running now and then, whether that's a Slack workspace, and make sure that, yeah, they have a way to reach out to you directly, and you have a way to actually spend time with them. It's what pays the most in my experience.
Thibaud, I noticed that you use the word unfortunately.
It's just, as developers, we all love to automate things. It's just one of those things that.
Hold on. So I primarily do not ID as a developer, right? So I think that's one of the reasons why it's really useful to have maintainers whose first response is not about automating things. That's why complementary skills can be really helpful, right? If you like developers very often, right, seeing any kind of problem, think, how can I code my way out of this? And often, hey, that's helpful. That's very beneficial. But also it's extremely useful to bring in maintainers who the first question is, well, how do we solve this? And then part of it might be people, might be process. And then if there's a problem that needs coding, possibly delegating that, right?
Yeah, and I think the automation portion of like the commit message checking, like automating the actual check makes sense. But then, as you mentioned, that communication on like how can we improve the commit message or how can we make this better next time is definitely something that works better in a conversation. You're not just going to send like an automated comment saying like this needs updating, but like really taking the time to make it. And not only does it make like your project better, but it also makes them better contributors to other projects, which improves like the whole open source ecosystem. So having those conversations is important for everybody and benefits everybody.
It is. I also want to say first, hey, Thibaud, I'm about to be switching my site to a Wagtail site. So thank you for that. But also, I also get why another aspect of the like, unfortunately, is just the sheer time commitment. And because there is an issue, just as you said, like if you have the time to have, these conversations, and Rose is absolutely right that this is an investment in people, not just as contributors to your project, but to, the entire industry. But I mean, I'm not getting paid by the entire industry. And in many cases, many of us are not getting paid at all, right? This is where bringing in more co-leaders and actually sustaining them with resources such as payment for their labor is part of the, how we actually can sustain both the code work and the people work and the process work, right? Necessary for all of this. So I just wanted to, I realized that it may have seemed like I jumped on you like some kind of jerk YouTube commenter, like, hey, you said one word that I'm going to disagree with, and now I'm going to dunk on you for points. That is not what I meant, and I'm sorry about that.
Don't worry about this at all. It's definitely my preference as well to favor those kinds of direct interactions. What Wagtail does is running sprints online or in person, things like Google Summer of Code as well. And I guess fostering those relationships, that's definitely my preference. There is plenty of room for automations as well. And GitHub does things like templates when you respond to issues. So there is a place for this as well, but small place.
I have a question regarding templates because saved replies are so helpful, right? Hey, Mr. Dougie, is there, sorry, I just want to call you by,
Mr. Dougie's my dad, but yes, I'll answer to that.
Is there a way to share saved replies with another contributor?
That is a great question. And as of today, not yet. And I use that term yet because like this is a feedback that I've heard already. I use save replies very heavily. And I love that I could respond, especially during Hacktoberfest. Like there's like some patterns you see in some newcomers, which is why I love the assign action. But also I love the fact that like my project, it's a small project, but it has a Discord. And I just, whenever you open up an issue or you open up a PR, you get an auto message because I can't see everything that opens up all 24 hours a day. But it just points you to Discord. And it's like, if you want instant like communication, like this, say hello in this channel, and I'll jump in there and say, okay, looks good. Maybe this, maybe that, maybe like flip this around. And you can have that conversation, not in the comments of the issue or the PR, because sometimes it's awkward to basically have that conversation happen in the open once your first time. And I don't want folks to feel like they did the wrong thing and not walking away, because I'd say that I've been doing this 9 years at programming professionally, and I've had interactions with projects where like there's a pre-commit hook that I didn't know what those were a thing when I first saw them, and I'm like, what is this? Like I don't know how to get out of this. Like so I'm just gonna walk away and never look at this project ever again because I'm too embarrassed to know how to get out of this pre-commit hook.
Yeah, I would like to add the Discord server is really a good idea because you can do like kind of pairing that, like if someone really struggling and you see that, oh, they're really trying, then if you really want to offer the help, you can kind of like, oh, let's arrange a section that we kind of share the screen and I can have a look and all this. So I think it's really good. I really like using Discord.
Yeah, I just want to say that was a real life example too. I literally could not get out of pre-commit hook, walked away from a project that I could have contributed to.
Yeah, just I put all of my saved replies in gists and share them with other team members. So it's not ideal, but it does get you where you need to go.
Yeah, I just shared in the chat that we just did this for NumPy as well. I know there are other projects too, because we have actually copied some of the messages from other projects, but it's the same idea of saved replies, and it just saves you time and lets you communicate with people more effectively.
Yeah, so Sumana touched on the financial point, and I have a question just for that, but we will lose like hours in this. So let me go for Thibaud first. So Thibaud, you talked about accessibility in Python packages, right? And yes, you said you checked 1,000 packages on PyPI to see how they're doing about accessibility, right?
Go on.
So could you share some of the most absurd, difficult things you saw? Without names, please, of course. And also, let me go there also. Also, suppose I want to start improving the accessibility of my project ASAP, but my team is small and we don't have that many resources. What do you think that could bring us the best effort to result ratio in the first moment? So where should we start, in your opinion?
That's a lot to unpack. I'll do my best. I didn't literally review the 1,000 packages. I just reviewed the list and then tried to think which of them basically might have issues. And the problem with accessibility, it can be quite taxing because it's a field where there are standards, but they aren't that commonly followed to the letter, which means that you're likely going to spend quite a bit of time reviewing things that don't meet those standards. So you have to be somewhat positive about this and, suggest improvements rather than, look at the mistakes, I guess. So in the Python ecosystem in particular, there are lots of people in the data science community that do tremendous amounts of teaching. And I think one thing I would suggest is just thinking of how those teaching resources That might not even be the project, but the resources around the project, making sure people can consume these as easily as possible. It's honestly things that might seem very simple, like just having multiple formats for a given resource, having something that's a video also as a document, having something that's a PDF also as a text files. It can be as basic as this. Coming back to where I spend most of my time, web development, I would say that there can be some misconception with developers that accessibility issues, you can find them with automated tools only. That isn't the case, but still there are plenty of automated tools that will take you to the 30% to 50% of issues found. So if you work on a web project, that's definitely the first port of call. And I can recommend in particular, there is one tool called Accessibility Insights. It's open source, built by Microsoft, and it extends another accessibility checker that's called Axe. That's quite well known. And so this one tool, Accessibility Insights, that's a browser extension in Chrome. And if you just install that in your browser, then you have access to both automated checks and manual checks that are basically as comprehensive as an expert could get to, or as basic as something you can have with a single click. So this is by far the best thing to start with.
Mm-hmm. Nice.
Yeah, I could talk about this for hours. So,
So Melissa.
Yeah, I just have a question about those, the tool that you were mentioning. Do they have actual people doing these tests? Do you have a group of people testing for accessibility issues? Because that's like you said, the automated tools will take you so far, but then you have to, to get the fine points, it would be nice to have actual people checking them. So I don't know if do you have ideas on that?
Yes, that's honestly still really hard because as you start talking about manual tests, it does require a fair amount of expertise. It's basically just like code review on a project. You do need to know the project quite well to make sense of it. So accessibility is the same thing. So I think I should start with the gold standard of this would be to involve people who actually have the access needs, who have disabilities, getting them onboarded with your projects. And it's honestly really hard to find those people. We have lots of diversity and inclusion issues in our field. So I'd say whatever you can do towards reaching out to those people is the first thing I would try. Then if you can't reach out to those people for whatever reason, what works is just reaching out to people who are experts in that field and asking them to do some of those audits with you. So in the case of Wagtail and Django, for example, we do part of the auditing automatically with the tools I had mentioned before. And then we have people like me who go through all of the pages of the Wagtail admin one by one and report issues back to people. Yeah, it's a fair amount of work, but it can happen.
Mm-hmm. So Jürgen is asking if most open source projects only have a GitHub and a PyPI page. Is there anything to do regarding accessibility?
That's a great question. I think I would start with the README, which is probably the most important document that each and every open source project has. Your README likely contains images. Your README might also link to things like videos. Might have lots of very few links. Just reviewing these through some of the guidelines that are out there for accessibility will definitely go quite a long way. I don't know how accessible GitHub itself is in particular, but I do know there are quite a few things you can do even in Markdown that would make people's lives better. One thing that's honestly is relevant everywhere in the world is providing alt text whenever you have visuals. So that's both in the README, that's both in your PyPI description. That's even the case if you share an image in Slack, always make sure that there is an alt text with that. I hope that helps.
Mm-hmm. So Brian, any thoughts on GitHub and accessibility?
So as right now, actively, we're going through an entire accessibility audit of all of GitHub owned properties. And right now I have stuff on my plate I have to fix because of that. So hopefully in the next month, GitHub will have an announcement or a blog post that says, hey, we did it. Everything's accessible. Today, obviously not the case. Well, sorry, not obvious, but the question came up. The answer is not the case every part of GitHub, especially your repos and stuff like that. But I just echo what Thibaud said, which is like make sure stuff that's in your markdown files, if it's in there, it's readable, it's supposed to encourage people to contribute or navigate. Make sure you have alt tags, make sure you have stuff that like make sure you use headers and stuff too as well. So that way stuff can be tabbed through. Sometimes we can just put in a big blob of text, but break stuff up so it's accessible to readers.
Awesome, thank you. More considerations about accessibility in your projects? Devs, Juanita? How's Spyder in this sense?
Well, we recently actually tried to have a more accessible interface. We were working with a UI designer, and she was helping us to make it a bit more accessible in terms of like the sizes of icons and buttons and stuff. And the other thing that I am concerned about, and I've been like trying to push a lot on this side, is translations. So for Spyder, we have we use crowding for translators, or we already have like several languages for the interface, but I'm trying to do that as well for documentation. So that's the other side I'm pushing towards, but we are gonna still keep working with the UI designer to keep going towards accessibility on the interface, and I hope to do a good job on documentation as well.
Thanks you all. Since I'm with Juanita already. So Juanita, you discussed your ideas on how to write more attractive documentation, right? How to generate better content for different groups and mainly a newer generation. Your ideas are already being implemented on Spyder, and I'd like to know, how is this material being received and used? And I personally love it. And also, are there any ideas on how to convince more old-minded developers that this approach is indeed useful, fruitful?
Well, so on the side of Spyder, I've seen the work is started basically with videos, like YouTube videos on it was like tutorials on how to use several things on Spyder, and I included these videos on the docs page, so people right now can watch the video inside the docs page. And they already, like, the most watched video has like 36,000 views, which I think it's a lot. And I think they're all like coming from the docs page. I don't think people are going to our YouTube channel because we don't have a lot of subscribers, but having this material embedded in documentation has been really good for people like to use it. We've received a lot of like good comments on the YouTube channel, and even in the issue tracker, sometimes we like reference some of the videos that we have, like when people are like having trouble, and they like we've had a lot of good responses from people saying like, yeah, this is great. And also I'm trying to make them fun so that they're like better to watch, which I think it's also good received by the community. I think that in terms to convince other out-minded maintainers, I would say that this is just like something extra from the material that everyone should be like doing, right? Like, I'm not saying you should only do videos, you should only do fun material. I think a lot of other people could just stick to PDFs or manuals or like reading content. I think a lot of people still enjoy that and are like better at doing that, but this is just a way of providing more resources for different kinds of people, and I think it's a good way to have like more accessible resources in that sense. So in terms of accessibility, I think it's also good to have different kinds of content. So yeah, let's go Millennial.
Thank you, Anita. So any more experiences on documentation, on how to improve documentation in that sense, speakers?
I would just say that we take a lot of input from our contributors. So sometimes we actually just yesterday, I worked on an issue where a contributor was like, it would be really nice if you had a section that explained this. And working on a tool, we didn't even think about that because it's just second nature to us to like, we don't need that explanation. But, you know, really creating a community where contributors are encouraged to ask for what they need is what has helped us improve our documentation a lot. as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Rose.
I'd like to add also that one of the things that I was working on was a community survey, and on that side, I agree on with Rose in that it's really good to have the input from people asking for things. And in the survey, I realized that there's a lot of people that don't know about some characteristics that Spyder has, and it's just like probably it's because it's not in the docs, or it's not like somewhere that people can be aware of this. So I think having the input from people, it's also a good thing for having the right information in docs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So thanks you all. So since we're going towards documentation and new users, Melissa. So first of all, let me tell you that I know the NumPy Newcomers project, and one may say that I know it from the inside now. And I think that the community effort that you and the others are doing there is commendable. So since NumPy is the north of scientific packages in Python, lots of stuff that you're doing there will be useful for us in other packages. So thank you for that. Now, let me ask you, NumPy is this large, mature package already, right? So that can be really scary for newcomers. In your experience, what's the barrier for people to start contributing and then continue in the long term? And I'd like to hear Juanita's opinions on that as well. How is it going with Spyder? Melissa?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And so I can only speak from my own experience because I don't exactly know the details for everyone else. But I think just to share, the code base is huge. And the other day we were talking about this at a community meeting, and I mentioned like, oh, I don't know about that because I don't know that part of the code base. And I actually don't know all the parts of the code base. And then someone said, oh, nobody does. I mean, it's impossible to know everything from NumPy. So you were talking about documentation, and I was thinking about the translations. And this is something that we have been discussing because we did do, so we have started on the translations for our website, but not for the documentation. So the NumPy documentation, if you print it out, it's like 1,500 pages. So it's huge. There's no way we can get the translations on that unless we have like a huge number of contributors able to translate, review, and, you know, make sure that things are good. Yeah, and the CPython documentation is huge, and the Brazilian Python community has done an excellent job of translating the documentation. So it is possible, but you need like the translations group for CPython in Brazil. We have a Telegram group with over 200 people. So that's what it takes, I guess, to get the translations going. And yeah, so I think it is, I think it's hard just because it's so huge, NumPy. Also because many people who look for Python packages to contribute to, they want to contribute in Python. And some of the code in NumPy is actually written in C. And so you have to understand the internals, you have to understand some of the templates, you have to, you know, it's a bit more technical. But at the same time, I think we are trying to put some effort into mentoring, into getting newcomers used to the issue tracker. We know that it's hard for a new user to come to GitHub and ask questions or say something and they think they might be wrong, or they think, you know, like, oh, my mistake is going to be immortalized in the NumPy GitHub issue tracker. And those are high barriers. So I think the newcomers meeting was also a way of getting people to know the ones behind the GitHub handles that they were interacting with. Because it's weird when you see a comment from XYZ on GitHub, they might be criticizing you and you might feel super scared. But if you know that person, you've seen them beforehand, it's so much easier to interact. So that's kind of the idea behind the newcomers meeting.
Thank you, Melissa. Juanita?
So in the side of a Spyder, we don't really have a lot of people like submitting PRs or like wanting to contribute actively. What I try to do, and like what the team tries to do mainly, is just Sometimes there's like people that report issues that are like bugs that they find and something, and sometimes we're like, oh, you can try to fix it, and we can try like to help them, like you can go to this line and maybe this is the error and you can try debugging, and like we try to help people to solve their own issues sometimes, and that works, and people open their own PRs, but we don't really have like a lot of people trying to contribute. I'm still trying to figure out ideas for that. I made a video recently, I'm gonna send the link, on like encouraging people to contribute not only to Spyder but to every like open source project. But I think it's just sometimes it's a bit intimidating at first, especially with larger projects. So I think getting resources for people to like find it easier and maybe less intimidating, it's important for us to get like new contributors that have the talent and the interests but are like maybe too intimidated or too afraid of like the process, because it's maybe too complicated at first. I don't know. So I've been trying to come up with ideas to make this easier for people, but we don't really have a lot of contributors like in Spyder wanting to submit PRs.
Thank you, Juanita. Yeah, so in order to ask a question to everyone, this should come with a trigger warning, okay? So I think the hairier questions come now. And May, so a trigger warning for burnout right now. So May, your talk showed what the effects of burnout can be and the stages one can reach when burned out. Of course, your talk is not to diagnose anyone, but I'll speak frankly, I identified myself a lot. I identified lots of my community a lot. And I know personally, I'm really burned out for a while already. So let me ask you, what are your experiences helping people that are apathetic already, and how they can start getting back to feel joy in their projects, in their work?
That's a tough one, Alex. The coach in me wants to ask you, what are you doing now to help you? But that's probably you want to hear from me. I don't want to open it up to you. It's quite a vulnerable place. Thank you for being so candid and honest. Yeah, it's tricky, and you know, I think having experienced it myself, I think the thing that I found, and you know, people that I've worked with have found, is actually taking a break and taking some time to really just nurture yourself and pursue a totally different interest if it's possible. I know in my presentation I talk about boundaries. I'm not so sure that works at a time when you're actually really in it. It's very difficult to establish. But what I would say is that it's more about amplifying other areas of your life. So rather than trying to compartmentalize things and be much more structured, it does help. It depends on your sort of personality and what you're feeling in the moment. But I think it's more about helping yourself amplify other interests so that the work that you're doing that's creating that situation where you're feeling burned out, you're able to step away and step back from it without feeling like you're cutting yourself off. It's actually just refocusing your energy and your emotion into a different space, if that makes sense. It depends. I can only say it really depends. I think when, you know, for some people, if it is really completely, you know, I used to see this like where I coach teachers, for example, and I used to be a teacher myself. In fact, that's where I experienced burnout. But for some people, if they don't step back and if they don't find another way to nurture themselves, you become dead wood in the system. And dead wood's a really, I think, quite a powerful metaphor. It's like when I think about the education environment, people are there just to, I don't know, because they have no other they feel trapped. They don't know what else they're going to do. They have no other identity, or they have no other way of seeing how they can, do anything different. And therefore their contribution and the impact and the value that they bring diminishes. And in fact, actually, the way in which you are perceived as a role model also diminishes. So I don't know, does that kind of help answer your question there?
It does.
We can take
Thank
it
you,
offline,
May.
Alex. I know it's always a tricky one, Burnout. But yeah. And then one thing I wanted to say, actually, Sumana mentioned before, is there anything missing from my talk? And I would say that actually it's one of those, burnout is one of those things that can creep up on you, actually. And you get caught up into a vicious cycle. And so even though I presented 6 steps, it's actually the steps 2, 3, and 4 that repeat over and over and over again. And that's like feeling anxious, feeling frustrated, then getting angry, okay? And you get angry with yourself, not just with others. And then you find a way to put the lid on it, and then you cope for a little bit longer, then the anxiety, the frustration. And so it's like you're in that loop for a very long time. And then, it's when you start to feel disconnected and alienated from what you do, that's when actually it starts to feel, it's almost a little bit too late, really. You really have to then just basically step right away and divorce yourself from a situation that actually is now becoming quite toxic.
Thank you, May. So we are almost blowing our time. I will ask permission from Eunice to do a last question.
Well, we can get, if everybody is happy with, the speakers, we can go over time. We have another 30 minutes.
And now the community will see that worse for me than burnout is discussing money. So, Sumana.
Hiya.
You discussed some great hypotheses for the leadership gap we have in open source currently. I'd like to add one more for your consideration, the lack of funding. And then I will hear this, oh, of course, Alex, right? So I think several developers and therefore leaders are going elsewhere, abandoning their projects, losing interest, due to the necessity of making enough to live, right? So then a company comes and offers them a job with no relation to that project, and the project itself loses in the process. So what do you think about that? And what are you seeing in that sense?
Thanks for the question. So just, I recognize that there are a lot of people attending this Q&A. Not everybody got to watch all the talks. So I'll mention that I shared a few hypotheses about how it could be, why it could be that we have a gap in how many leaders and maintainers we have in open source. And I think we don't have enough of a pipeline of leaders and maintainers so that we can help have some replacements so that people can pass the baton on. One of them had to do with tooling. One of them had to do with new problems, like what got us here won't get us there. Another had to do with culture and values. And then I did mention corporate involvement as one of these, that it changes things, that sometimes companies hire some people who have managerial skills and maybe take them out of open source work entirely. That is something that I mentioned briefly. So money is an aspect to this. I think there was a second part of your question, which is maybe what do we do about it? Is that right?
What are you seeing we can do about it, and your experiences on that?
Sure. there's a few things. One is that people who get hired right now, it's an amazing market for technologists. Like I'm hearing and seeing that at least in the United States, people who are getting hired have the ability to negotiate a lot in terms of salary. One of the things that you can negotiate is, I would like to continue to work on open source, and get it in writing, get it in your offer letter that some percentage of the time, you're working on open source projects. So that's one thing you can do. And the moment that you're getting that new job is a really important moment. That's the moment you hold a lot of power, and you can say, these are things that I want, money, professional development time, and things like, I want N% of my time, I want to be working on open source. If it's in your contract, then you can hold on to that, even when managers say, well, we want you to do this proprietary work for the company. So that's a part of this kind of solution. Another is that I think, and I talked about this a little bit in both my maintainer summit talk and also my training. There was an education and training summit as well at the SpyCon. I talked about this in this talk as well, that if we don't have enough of a pipeline of people with these leadership skills, let's build one. Let's grow more of those people, right? So that's something that we can do a little bit of work on as volunteers. It's also something that, if the open source industry as a whole benefits from there being maintainers, benefits from more maintainers happening, then it would make sense for GitHub, Red Hat, now an IBM company, right? All these companies to actually invest in mentorship and training and apprenticeship programs. Similar, we're seeing that, for more than 10 years, we've seen Google Summer of Code and Outreachy help with the intake. GSOC just does code, right? They have refused, right, to try and move beyond code. Then they added Season of Docs recently. Outreachy, for the past many years, has instead said, well, a lot of different contributions are welcome, right? If you want to learn to be a maintainer, a marketer, a designer, a translator, and so on, those are all things we're going to help with, to have apprentices, give them a stipend so that they can learn to be open source contributors with that skill set. We're seeing some leadership programs. We saw that Mozilla's leadership program has now gotten, I want to say copied, but in a good way, right? Like there's many different iterations of it in lots of places. In the open science world, we're seeing that the science, open science facilitators, open science community coordinator, there is at least one program, if not multiple programs, that people are going through every year to learn how to be community coordinators of open source projects specifically, or open science projects, I should say. So there's a few of these things. What I would like to see is some substantial funding and support for projects like the one that I am working on, right, to help grow more leaders, so that, all right, industry is going to hire some number of them, but it won't leave as much of a gap if we have more of those people around. I think I don't know yet, like, the numbers of this, right? These are hypotheses. One reason I did this talk was to say, hey, people should let me know if I'm wrong. People, please let me know if nope, none of these numbers make sense. And I tried to share some ways that people could check if any of these hypotheses actually make sense.
So, Sumana, can I just ask, is funding, it sounds like funding's ad hoc, or are you, I'm not an insider, I'm not a coder, unfortunately. I wish I was, but my sense is that things in the open source community happen organically, and that's the wonderful thing about it, right? It's just so creative and so rich and complex, and out of that chaos becomes something really beautiful that people create. However, and this was really apparent when I was doing the research for the presentation on burnout, funding was one area that didn't seem to get a lot of focus, yet it's a really big factor and could help with so many environmental triggers, in terms of what you talk about, resourcing, recognition, the whole reward aspect, development. So I'm just wondering, what
I mean, I don't know, but is there a little bit more of a formal way that people can approach the whole funding aspect?
Yes. So because of a number of these issues that people have been talking about for definitely a few years now, I co-founded a working group under the auspices of the Python Software Foundation called the Project Funding Working Group. And you can think of a lot of different categories of open source as existing, some of which make sense to fund by a single business, right? And so you look at, for instance, GitHub itself makes some open source projects that it produces that are open source, right? The core platform is proprietary, which is not great, and which locks us in, much of the community into a vendor that, is privately owned and that we don't have a voice in. So that's not great. But a number of GitHub's projects are open source. So that's sort of a category of project, right? Then there's categories of project that, one or two or very few people care about and they work on as volunteers. There are categories of project where a number of different businesses sort of are in a consortium to work on things together. There are things that are much more about academia. Maybe there's an academic consortium or just one academic department. So there's all these different categories of open source, right? And these different categories generally then, because of these different attributes, are appealing to different stakeholders in terms of who's willing to pay, who's interested in paying, who thinks, well, I'd like to fund that. And part of what the Project Funding Working Group is trying to do is say, all right, for the different kinds of project, both quote big and small, that are under the large umbrella of Python, here are some resources so that you can self-help and say, oh, maybe this funding opportunity would be helpful to me. Maybe this way of thinking about funding would be appropriate to me. And then for really substantial projects that millions of people depend on, like the core of Python itself, like the Python packaging infrastructure and things like that, the Python Software Foundation's Project Funding Working Group started, creating some resources and writing, grant applications and things like that. But now we actually have, as of new this year, at the PSF, a paid full-time staffer, Morgan Mayo, who is going to be working on this stuff for the PSF. And I'm sure that there's probably been some kind of a talk. I haven't looked thoroughly at the PyCon schedule, but I'm sure that somewhere within the PyCon schedule is something where you can hear more about what it is that that this new director of development is doing, right? She comes from the nonprofit fundraising space, right? There's a lot of conversation. There are many resources in to help address the question of how does the industry actually not completely fall down on the job of continuing to feed the goose that lays the golden eggs, right? There's quite a bit of in the way of resources and help, some of which I help to produce, if you are that goose, right, of where you're looking for feed. So I'm going to share a couple of links in the chat, but yes, this is a matter of ongoing concern. And let me put it this way, there are multiple different startups that are trying to work on this as the main thing they're trying to work on.
Thank you, Sumana. Thank you, May. Carol, so before we end, Carol, you had raised your hand before May. So would you like to?
Yeah, I mean, I'll if I can, I'll share two things. One is thank you, May, for bringing up the issue of burnout. It is real. I had a very toxic startup experience, and I'm also really busy in open source. I now have a wonderful startup experience. However, it took me probably 8 months to kind of feel like, okay, I can even face my email box. And yet I was already committed to a bunch of things in the open source world and had to really pick and choose, okay, what fills my cup versus what drains me. I had to really trust the other members of the steering council, Eva and others, to just basically say, I cannot take on anything. I can't even do the commitments that I've already got on my plate. As such, the docs work group took about a year to get off the ground. But, you know, I think taking care of yourself, and I said it before my talk yesterday at the Language Summit, we're in a community where, you know, it's so important, particularly in this past year, to really take care of yourselves. And it is not a failure to take time off or to take a break. For those maintainers that aren't aware, there is a project called Jazz Band that kind of provides stopgap maintainership for projects, which can be a real help, because sometimes if you're like a solo maintainer, you feel the pressure even more because you're like, who's going to take care of this in my absence? So I throw that out there. And then, you know, on the other topic, Sumana, spot on in so many different ways. And I think one thing that I would add, you know, just even beyond the funding, but in terms of building leaders and leadership skills within the community, one of the things that I have found really challenging is if you do the leadership work, like project management or documentation or people management or whatever, you often will hear, but you're not technical, or she's not technical. And it's like, give me an effing break. I could code, I can code. I'm choosing to work on the stuff that has a multiplier effect. And anything we can do to change that cultural perception, Sumana, would be amazing. And just keep writing and keep holding people accountable, because you are so awesome. So thank you, everybody, for putting this together. You are a fabulous group of human beings. Keep doing great work.
Thank you, Carol. A point that I think I make frequently is just open source. In the open source industry, people who particularly want to write functions and classes are overrepresented, right? They're relatively abundant compared to people who have the skills and the interest in doing all the other things that it takes to make software useful and successful. So I can program, I'm going where I'm needed, I'm going where I'm more useful. And, you know, and there's a need for that. So I think that also means we're more valuable in some ways.
Yeah. So any final considerations, everyone?
I just wanted to mention real quick that I do know there are conversations around what Sumana you had brought up internally at GitHub. We're just too early in the conversations to like say something, but I'd say last year during the summer, we did a pilot program with students in particular and getting contributions, basically mentoring them to be contributors on the project. So like sort of like Summer of Code, but with the GitHub umbrella and sort of party planning that we did. So it was like a very small pilot, but it worked.
GitHub's also doing a maintainers summit type thing this year, and it's the first year that I've seen it. So
yep, June 15th, I think. I might got the date wrong.
It's the week of June 7th, like the whole week of June, like, you know, 7th through the 12th is like maintainer week and stuff. I am also speaking at Upstream, which is a Tidelift event that's happening June 7th.
I'll also be speaking there around maintainer hospitality, or sorry, open source hospitality. So it covers a lot of these things.
Okay. So thank you all. I'll popcorn to Eunice.
I just wanted to add to Brian's comment. It's great that GitHub is taking initiative to offer more mentorship. I think we need more of these programs. And thank you so much, everyone who joined us today. Great questions and great answers, truly thought-provoking. Keeping the wheels of open source turning is quite a task. I hope these 2 days of the summit helped you in some way to find answers and solutions to the challenges you face as maintainers. If you haven't already, check out the videos on your YouTube channel. I think we've posted quite a few links, or just go on YouTube and search for Maintainers Summit at PyCon US 2021. Take care of yourself, and if you can, of others too.
Thank you so much.
And I want to thank Inessa and Alex for organizing this and running it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Thanks, Inessa. Thanks, Sumana, for the help. Thank you, everyone. It was great.
Yeah, thank you. It's very enjoyable. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Brian, that beer.
Yes, I already followed you on GitHub, which I know doesn't mean a lot of currently, but yes, I will connect with you.
Awesome.
Bye.